Ready. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Time is 1:15 p.m. We will go back on the record. We do have one housekeeping matter, but honestly, Mr. Uda is not back from lunch. So what I think we'll do, as the parties will recall, we had Mr. Uda ask for some information as part of his cross. Northwest Energy is ready to ask their witness about that, but so what we'll do is we're at the point where we have commissioner questioning. If Mr. Uda returns, there he is. Welcome back, Mr. Uda. I'm just going to make the reference to Mr. Spicoli, if you understand that colloquy. Yes, it is, Mr. Spicoli. All right. So in response to your request that this witness provide some information, I'm going to go out of regular order here, allow Northwestern Energy to voir dire its witness to see if they provide a response to what you asked. All right, Mr. Hensley.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Steinmetz, you were asked a few questions about a reference to a QF that was expected to come online and a QF that did not come online, and a QF that also, a separate QF that actually came online in reference to pages 7 and 8 of your direct testimony. Were you able to identify which QF you were referring to that was expected to come online that did not reach commercial operation?
Yes, that was the Crazy Mountain facility.
And were you also able to confirm your reference to the QF that actually came online midway through the 2019-2020 period?
Yes, that was South Peak.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. Commissioner questions, Vice President Fielder.
No questions of this witness, Mr. President.
Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you, Mr. Steinmetz. One thing that continues to bother me, I think I might have alluded to this in an earlier witness, and that is that, I read through all this testimony and the company did a really good job making a case for all of the things and then produced a stipulation which eliminated many of the contention things or all of them, whatever. What I wanted to know was the original application by the company. Did that do anything to enhance the work that you do? And conversely, the stipulation, did it take those things away and leave you in a unfavorable position to do your job expeditiously?
Commissioner O'Donnell, thank you for the question. My testimony specifically about the PCAM as proposed in my direct and rebuttal testimony, I think was from Northwestern's perspective, what would be most helpful in having a PCAM base that is designed well to meet the needs of the customers and to help me specifically in procuring energy. I think in very large part that remains the case. I'm not Northwestern's witness to talk about the stipulation, and there are others who could do that, but I don't feel hampered in any way in my ability to do my job to procure energy on behalf of customers based on the stipulation.
Very good. Thank you.
Commissioner Pinochi?
No questions, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner Pinochi. Commissioner Bukacek?
I have a couple questions. Mr. Steinmetz, can you quantify in dollars the cost to Northwest Energy of Schedule 11 Flex Reserve Service and any other costs that are incurred due to the use of variable intermittent sources of energy?
Commissioner, the rate schedule you reference is part of our open access transmission tariff And specifically that's for an ancillary service that applies to wind generators. So that schedule applies to resources that aren't in Northwestern's portfolio, but that Northwestern provides service to. So that the rate for that service was determined through a FERC rate review process. And the customers who take that service pay the rate that was determined by that process. I don't have a dollar amount of quantification for what that is, but it was arrived at through that FERC rate case process.
Is there someone else that would have the quantification? Is there someone else I could ask, a later witness?
It may be that one of the finance witnesses was able to point to the revenue credit that comes from those ancillary services. I don't know whether it is in that level of detail down to the particular schedule.
Okay, thank you. No more questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Bukacek. I do not have any questions for this witness. Mr. Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Mr. Steinmetz. Could I refer you to Exhibit JMS 5, which was included with your rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Okay. The bottom right-hand corner of that sheet reflects a total PCAM cost and credits of $208,282,098. Is that correct?
Yes.
And on that same exhibit, just a few lines up, you reflect total capacity costs of $57,098,905. Is that correct?
Yes, the cost, and that's the cost of capacity contracts, the capacity component of capacity contracts. Yes.
So could you describe for me what each of the three accounts for those capacity contracts reflect, what lines 42, 43, and 44 are meant to capture?
Yes. So line 42 is labeled operating reserves, and that line is tied to contracts that we have in place. Actually, at the time of the testimony, had in place for operating reserves, or sometimes called contingency reserves. And that's a contract we have with a third party to provide that service to help us meet our requirements. The next line down, existing capacity purchases, again refers to contracts that were in the portfolio at the time of the testimony. And these are with a number of third parties in the region. And that is for service to help us meet our peak load requirements. We pay a capacity payment on a monthly basis, and the party is then contractually obligated to provide us energy when we call on it. And the third line in that section, expected capacity purchases, represents the same type of contract, but that was not in the portfolio yet at the time that this exhibit was prepared. And it anticipates the purchase of additional capacity to meet our requirements. Hadn't been executed yet, but was anticipated.
So if the commission later approves acquisition of a capacity resource, an owned capacity resource, as opposed to a contracted capacity resource, what effect would that approval have? What effect would you expect that approval to have on those three cost accounts?
I would expect that in future PCAM base resets, that the amount of capacity we would need to procure with contracts such as these would be reduced, all else equal, and therefore the dollars associated with that would be lower.
Okay, thank you. Do I understand correctly that the total PCAM base that you've proposed here includes an element of forecasting or modeling the capacity costs into the future?
It does for the 1 year period covered by this PCAM base that was from July of 22 through June of 2023 was an estimate of the cost of procuring capacity for that period.
Okay. Could you please describe to me how you modeled capacity reservation costs in your PCAM base model?
Yes, we estimated the amount we would need based on our peak load forecast plus planning reserve margin. That determined the amount that we would need. And the dollar value of that was based on the fixed costs of an Aero gas plant, as I discussed earlier in my testimony today.
Okay. Could you identify for me all the capacity contracts that would extend more than 1 year in your forecast period?
Yes, and there, I can name a few of them, and they were listed in discovery response as well. We have 3 main counterparties for those contracts, 4, I should say. The first is the Basin Creek facility, which is a gas-fired plant in Butte that we've had under contract for a number of years. We also have a contingency reserves or operating reserves contract in place with PowerX, which extends, I believe, through the end of 2023. And then we have an additional contract with PowerX for 100 megawatts of capacity. That is a 5-year deal that began on January 1st of 2023. I believe that runs through 2027. And we have a purchase from Heartland Generation that is a 10-year deal that has about 9 years remaining.
So with each of those 3 counterparties, Northwestern has negotiated the terms of the purchase of capacity and energy, correct?
Yes, the Basin Creek negotiation occurred 15 or more years ago. The PowerX 100 megawatt transaction actually came out of the RFP that we ran in 2020. And the Heartland purchase was negotiated. I actually neglected one other counterparty. We also have capacity contracts in place with Morgan Stanley. And that was negotiated as well.
So for my next question, I'd like to avoid any confidential information. So if you could refrain from answering with any specific calculations of prices, is it fair to assume that each one of these contracts has a different method of calculating the price that Northwestern pays for energy and capacity?
Yes, I'd say each involve their own negotiation or response to an RFP. And so how the counterparty approached that and how Northwestern might have approached that at the time might be different.
So does your forecast of the costs reflected in the PCAM base model take into account the particulars of each one of those contracts, the different ways in which energy and capacity would be valued in those contracts?
I'd say that the method we used wasn't directly tied to the existing contracts. As I mentioned, we used the cost of an aero derivative gas-fired plant as a proxy for that market price of capacity. And I should say that the reason we need to do that is because unlike the energy market, there isn't a good visible market for capacity. And so those prices aren't really observable. There's not a good third-party source for those like there is for energy, for example.
So each of those contracts involves a price that Northwestern pays for energy and capacity, right? Usually 2 separate price terms?
Yes.
But Northwestern has not used the particulars for pricing energy in those contracts in order to inform its PCAM base here. Is that correct?
And you're speaking of the forecast capacity price with that question, or are you talking about the energy
cost, the energy cost in particular.
Okay. Yeah, all of those contracts that we have in place are based in one way or another on index price of electricity or the cost of natural gas fuel times a multiplier. And so they really reflect the same kind of pricing we'd expect in short-term market purchases. So the capacity portion of each of those contracts is really the key. And the energy price we expect to pay when we call on those resources is effectively the spot price of electricity at the time. And so really that's where the energy cost of those contracts would come into play.
Okay. Shifting gears just slightly. I don't know if you were able to listen to earlier days of this hearing when we talked about FERC transmission crediting, and in particular, the suggestion of MCC's witness that we should also account for transmission losses. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes, I recall some of it.
And the response that we've had so far is that to account for those as part of the revenue credit would double count the transmission loss because it's also included in the PCAM. Could you describe for me how transmission losses are included in the PCAM?
Yes, and specifically, I'm talking here about the losses that third parties who use our transmission system incur and therefore pay. What happens is they pay for those losses to Northwestern based on our transmission tariff, our OAT. And this is the way they pay for that is at the EIM, energy imbalance market, spot price, the locational marginal price for the period that those losses are incurred. So they're at the market rate. As part of the PCAM energy imbalance line, which is here in, oops, I'm gonna get one page. It is line 20 of the PCAM. The losses paid by third parties on our system comes back to our customers as a credit in that row, along with the other imbalance costs and credits.
Are you referring to line 20 of page 2? Or is that page 1?
I think it's on both page 1 and page 2. It's labeled as imbalance and EIM costs and credits in both cases. Sorry, I'm in exhibit JMS 5.
So I'm looking at exhibit JMS 5, line 20. And if I'm reading this correctly, it reflects 0 total.
Correct. Thanks for the opportunity to clarify. Yes, we forecast 0 imbalance, either cost or credit in the base because we can't anticipate whether we will be long or short, if we will be selling or buying within the hour going out those 12 months. So the losses flow to customers in the actual portion of the PCAM after the fact. So that credit for losses paid by other customers comes back as a credit in the actuals. It's not in the forecast.
All right. So your PCAM base includes no forecast of those transmission losses being paid by the wholesale customers.
That's right. The base does not have a forecast in there. That's correct.
But each year when Northwestern comes in to true up the base, you will use the actual payments received from wholesale customers.
Yes, that is my understanding of what's included in the actuals.
Okay.
And Ms. Rich may be able to add more detail on the accounting side of that.
All right. I think that answers all of my questions. Thank you, Mr. Steinmetz. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. Well, Ms. Trinnell, I won't forget you this time. Mr. Uda?
No questions.
And I think it was Ms. Chilcott that asked. Yes.
No questions. Thank you.
Okay. Northwest Energy redirect.
No questions.
All right. So we had some confusion up here at the podium. So I believe we were on Northwestern redirecting.
No questions.
Okay, thank you. So do you temporarily excuse or want to permanently excuse this witness?
Chairman, but may we please permanently excuse this witness?
All right. Is there objection to permanently excusing this witness? Seeing none. Thank you, Steinmetz.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. You are permanently excused. All right, Northwest Energy, your next witness.
Thank you. Northwestern calls Danny Williams.
Afternoon. Ms. Williams, have you been sworn in? All right. Do you want to raise your right hand? Ms. Williams, do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Okay. All right. Counsel, go ahead and identify yourself at this point.
Mr. President, this is Mitch Warbell on behalf of Northwestern Energy.
All right. Your witness.
Thank you. Ms. Williams, would you please state and spell your name for the court reporter?
Danny Williams, DANIE WILLIAMS.
By whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
And what is your title?
I'm the manager of energy efficiency and DSM services.
And your business address?
11 East Park Street, Butte, Montana.
Did you file testimony in this docket?
I did.
Do you have before you would have been pre-marked as exhibits NWE 22 and 23?
I do.
A note for the record that we provided these exhibits to the court reporter and parties. Is exhibit NWE 22 a true and accurate copy of your pre-filed direct testimony and exhibits?
It is.
Is exhibit NWE 23 a true and accurate copy of your pre-filed rebuttal testimony? Do
Yes, it is.
you have any corrections to your testimony?
I do not.
If I were to ask you the same questions in your testimony today under oath, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
Mr. President, I move to admit NWE 22 into the record.
The objection to the admission of NWE 22. Seeing none, NWE 22 is admitted.
And Mr. President, I would also move to admit NWE 23 into the record.
All right. Any objection to the admission of NWE 23? Seeing none, NWE 23 is admitted.
And with that, I tender my witness for cross-examination. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Brown.
No questions.
Mr. Nelson. Captain Duffy. Ms. Chanel.
Just one or two. Hi, Danny. How are you? I'm Monica Trino.
Hi, Ms. Chanel.
Are you involved in the upcoming procurement plan IRP that you're working on?
I do have a chapter included related to demand side management.
Okay. Can you give us a rough view of how you're approaching DSM in the current procurement plan?
It is relatively close to the testimony that I provided in this general rate review.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Trudeau. Mr. Rivas.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Ms. Williams.
Good afternoon, Mr. Rivas.
For the record, Diego Rivas, on behalf of HRC 11, NRDC, and Northwest Energy Coalition. Yeah. Is that better? Hey, Ms. Williams, I'd like to ask you some questions on energy efficiency and demand side management. You would agree, would you not, that cost-effective energy efficiency is inherently the cheapest energy resource utility can acquire?
Yes, that's what demand side management is expected to do, as long as it is what is considered to be cost effective.
And you would agree that energy efficiency and demand side management benefit all customers, whether they participate in the program or not?
Yes, cost effective energy efficiency can benefit all customers.
And that's because energy efficiency, demand side management eliminates the need to acquire more expensive resources. Isn't that right?
Yes, it can.
And not getting into the specifics, but there are other benefits too of energy efficiency that could potentially benefit all customers. Isn't that true?
Some may consider additional benefits to energy efficiency, yes.
And it would follow then that had Northwestern not been acquiring any energy efficiency, its own costs and thus rates to customers would have been higher than if it had acquired the energy efficiency that it has.
Potentially, yes.
I want to turn to page 9 of your direct testimony. Let me know when you are there.
I'm there.
On the top of that page, you talk about the 2017 demand side management acquisition plan. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that acquisition plan arose out of an energy efficiency study that was done around that same time, or the 2017 conservation potential assessment, correct?
That is correct.
And the conservation potential assessment forms the basis or the foundation of your efficiency programs, does it not?
That forms our goals and acquisition plan. It does not necessarily dictate in a particular program year what will be cost effective for us to offer our customers.
And on lines 6 through 9 of page 9, you discussed that the current energy efficiency targets that arose out of that 2017 conservation potential assessment were 3.9 average megawatts for the first 5 years. Is that right?
That's correct.
And then decreasing to 3.35 average megawatts after that, correct?
Correct.
Okay, and so based on that plan, today as we sit currently, Northwestern is targeting 3.35 average megawatts per year.
Correct.
Okay. And to be clear, just for some people might not be familiar with the term average megawatts. That's the same as 29,346 megawatt hours per year if you did the 3.35, right? So it's, let me ask the question a different way. That's 1 megawatt for each hour of the year, 8,760 hours, correct?
Yes, I'd agree with that calculation.
Great. And then prior to that 2017 DSM acquisition plan, Northwestern was targeting 6 average megawatts, was it not?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And would you agree that Northwestern conducts a conservation potential assessment and updates its efficiency targets roughly every 5 to 6 years?
That has been our typical analysis timeframe, yes.
And in line with that timeline, 2023 being 6 years after 2017, when you conducted your last assessment, you're currently under contract to do a new conservation potential assessment this year. Do I have that right?
That among a few other studies, yes.
Can you provide an update on that assessment, where you are in that process and expected conclusion date?
I don't have an expected conclusion date, but we are under contract with a consulting firm named Applied Energy Group, and we actually had a kickoff in February of 2023.
Do you expect that new potential study to be done by the end of June of this year?
I do not.
Okay. And Northwestern's DSM program operates on a on a program year, kind of like a fiscal year, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so your program year runs from July 1st to June 30th.
Correct.
I want to turn to page 13 of your direct testimony.
I'm there.
In the first few lines, you discuss Northwestern's previous rate case and the commission's order for a temporary stakeholder group. Is that right?
Yes.
And that order initially stated that the advisory group was supposed to provide input for the 2020-2021 DSM program year. Is that your recollection?
That is my recollection.
So that would have been for July 1st, 2020 through June 30th, 2021.
That is correct. And then we subsequently communicated with the Montana Public Service Commission that we weren't able to implement some of the recommendations by that time.
Okay, but that was after. So to get the timeline correct here, you initially requested a 1-year delay from 2020, 2021 because of some timing issues with the order, et cetera, to delay that to 2021, 2022. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you mentioned in your testimony that you originally held 6 meetings with that advisory group, correct?
Correct.
And Northwestern's intent was indeed to have that advisory group provide input for that program year running from July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022?
Correct. A lot of it too was to educate the stakeholder group and make sure that they understood not only Northwestern service territory in Montana, but our general approach to demand side management.
But the actual purpose of the group was to provide input to Northwestern on how it should operate its DSM programs, correct?
That's correct.
And at the conclusion of those meetings, the stakeholders did indeed provide some recommendations to Northwestern, correct?
Yes.
And those recommendations related to how Northwestern utilizes the information from your potential assessment and determines the cost effectiveness of efficiency measures. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Northwestern's response was that it could not consider those recommendations for implementation for the 2021-2022 program year. Do I have that right?
You do.
And you stated in the response instead that you would complete a new conservation potential assessment.
Yes, that's correct. We would also look at some additional metrics within those studies that hadn't been yet defined.
And that conservation potential assessment, as you established earlier, would have been in line with Northwestern's historic practice about 6 years after its most previous one, right?
Generally speaking, yes.
Okay. And Northwestern provided that response to the advisory group in March of 2021?
Correct.
So as we sit today with the new conservation potential assessment and your indication that it would not be completed by June 30th of this year, it's true that the new conservation potential assessment could not influence DSM programs for Northwestern until July 1st, 2024. Is that not right?
Not unless some of the work that's being done by those studies is able to supplement our current program design.
And that would be a full 3 years after you provided a response to the advisory group in March of 2021.
That's correct from a timeline perspective.
Thank you. I want to turn your rebuttal testimony starting at DLW 3.
I'm there.
And the last paragraph on that page, starting at line 10, you discuss working with your program administrator, DMV. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Could you describe that process after you have done your potential assessment and how you work with DMV to decide how to implement your programs?
I would make one clarification to your statement. We evaluate each measure for its cost effectiveness, and then we work with DNV to help understand what implementation costs we might incur in offering those measures as a portfolio or a program. And then once DNV gives us those costs, we can evaluate for overall cost effectiveness to make sure that we are going to be offering a cost-effective program or think we're going to be offering a cost-effective program.
Okay, so one of the main data points coming out of that is an estimation of how much savings will come about for each of those previously determined to be cost-effective energy efficiency measures. Is that right?
That's correct. We essentially try to make a guess of how much participation from each measure and the overall energy savings that will be contributed by those measures to evaluate if a cost-effective program can indeed be offered to our customers.
Okay, could you turn to page DLW 5?
I'm there.
On line 5, you state that Northwestern has exceeded by at least almost double its annual DSM acquisition goals over the last 4 program years. Do you see that?
I do.
These numbers haven't been independently verified, have they?
Not by a third party, no. We use our the estimates from the potential assessments to be able to calculate the energy savings, and then based on the costs that we incur, calculate the overall cost benefit analysis.
And you would agree that it's standard practice for many utilities to do independent verification of its reported savings?
I'm not sure if it's standard practice necessarily. I know that third party evaluations do happen.
Could you now turn to the page DLW 11 in your rebuttal?
I'm not seeing a DLW 11 in rebuttal.
1 second. I'm sorry, on your direct DLW 11. I'm sorry.
I'm there.
Could you read the first 2 lines for me, please?
Reported energy savings represent the annual energy savings that would occur if all energy savings measures were in place for a full year.
Okay, and the word annual is underlined, correct?
Correct.
So if I understand correctly, the reported numbers that you discuss as being double what your targets aren't actually what Northwestern actually achieved in that year, but rather what Northwestern would have achieved if all of the measures had been in place for a full year. Isn't that right?
Could you maybe restate the question?
Based on your testimony on lines 1 to 2, your reported energy savings aren't actual savings that Northwestern has acquired when you report those savings, but rather what Northwestern would have acquired over a full year. Is that correct?
Because we operate a fiscal year July 1 through June 30th, we when we incent a customer to install a particular energy efficiency measure, we count the savings from that measure starting at the time that we incent that customer. And that is, that's really the timeline for the start of that energy savings.
So if you had a customer that started receiving efficiency incentives in, say, December, which would be halfway through your program year, when you made your savings reporting, you would report how much savings you would anticipate for a full year. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Despite the customer only actually achieving savings for 6 months.
That is true, knowing that those energy savings will continue through the life of that particular measure.
Last question. Notwithstanding that the numbers are not an actual full year acquisition number, or that they are not independently verified, would you not agree that exceeding a goal by almost double for 4 consecutive years is indicative that the process has some failures within it?
I do not. Typically, avoided costs are a primary determinant of energy efficiency. and whether or not certain measures may fall into a program. And with that, avoided costs may change year over year. So we evaluate for current program design on an annual basis.
And you update your avoided cost every year, correct?
That is correct.
Do you update your annual energy savings targets every year?
We do not.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no more questions.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Rivas. Mr. Uda.
No questions.
Renewable Northwest.
No questions.
MEIC. Okay. Commissioner questions, Vice President Fielder.
No questions, Mr. President.
Commissioner O'Donnell. Commissioner Pinochi.
No questions.
Commissioner Bukacek.
No questions, Mr. President.
I don't have any questions for this witness. Mr. Hamilton.
No questions.
Okay. Well, I'll give Ms. Trinell, do you have any? Okay. Redirect.
Just one, Mr. President. In response to my friend, Mr. Rivas, did Northwestern need to do a new conservation assessment before it could move forward with the stakeholders' recommendations?
To be able to fully consider those recommendations, we believed it prudent to do updated studies. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Would you like to?
We'd like to permanently excuse this witness, please.
All right. Any objection to permanently excusing Ms. Williams? Seeing no objection, Ms. Williams, you are permanently excused. Thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
All right. Next witness.
Northwestern calls John Schaefer.
Good afternoon, Mr. Schaefer.
Thank you.
Have you been sworn?
I have not.
Okay. Go ahead and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Heim, your witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Schaefer. Can you please state your name and spell your last for the record, please?
My name's Jonathan Schaefer. My last name spelled S-H-A-F-E-R.
And by whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
And what is your title?
Manager of System Innovation.
And did you submit pre-filed direct testimony in this docket?
Yes, I did.
And is that what is in front of you marked as Northwestern 25?
It is.
And if I were to, I'm sorry, let me back up. Is it a true and accurate copy of your testimony?
It is.
If I were to ask you the same questions under oath today, would you answer the same?
I would.
Do you have any corrections to your testimony?
I do not.
Mr. Chairman, I would move the admission of Northwestern 25.
Any objection to the admittance of Northwestern 25? Seeing none, Northwestern Energy 25 is admitted.
Thank you. At this time, we would tender Mr. Schaefer for cross-examination.
Okay. Mr. Brown?
No questions.
Mr. Nelson? Captain Duffy? Ms. Trinell? I think she said no questions. Okay. Mr. Rivas? Mr. Uda?
No questions.
Renewable Northwest? May I see? All right. Commissioner questions, Vice President Fielder?
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, I do have some questions. Mr. Schaefer. Mr. Schaefer, would you please turn to page 5 of your testimony?
I'm there.
Okay. On lines 2 through 6, you Of page 5, you identify how many electric meters and gas modules were installed in 2021, correct?
Correct.
And you also identify how many planned installations would occur in 2022, correct?
Correct.
Do you have updated information on what was installed in 2022, what was actually installed?
Actually, I didn't prepare the actual numbers for 2022. This is the estimate that I have. So it's approximately 226,000 since I put together this testimony.
Okay. Of the meters you installed in 2021 and 2022 under the meter program, were any of those meters non-AMI meters?
They were not.
Okay. And when does Northwestern expect to complete the meter project?
In 2025.
I'm looking at on page 5, line lines that begin, or paragraph that begins with line 8. Specifically on line 10, you say more than half of the AMR meters and the encoder receiver transmitters deployed in Northwestern's Montana service territory are already at, over, or soon approaching the end of their design service life. Can you please tell me what the designed service life is?
So specifically, especially gas modules are operated by a battery. And so the battery design life is 20 years. Same thing from our manufacturer for the ERT that was installed in electric meters has a design life of 20 years as well.
And the AMRs, is that part
That's
of?
AMR, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And of the half or so that are at, over, or soon approaching, do you have a distinction of how many years we're talking about? In when you say they're at end of life, do you mean they're at 20 years? They're 20 years old?
That's what I'm stating here, and that's correct.
And what do you mean by soon approaching end of service life?
I mean, it's there's kind of that time period you have new customers, right? So you're always installing meters throughout the lifetime of throughout the project or throughout new construction. You're replacing meters, and so the majority of our meters are, half of them are at end of life, and by 2030 or 2032, all of them will be. And so one thing I do want to note that, as we're going through this project, we are removing electric meters, right? And we're actually putting them back into inventory if they're less than 10 years old and reusing them in places that do not have AMI yet. And so we're not purchasing new AMR meters for the ones that, we're currently recycling to extend that service life of that AMR meter.
Okay, so what you're telling us then is that if there's a AMR meter that's less than, is 10 years old or less, you're actually able to reuse that meter potentially. You're not just throwing them out.
That's correct.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And then I do want to state the same thing with gas modules last year. I mean, I think you guys all heard inventory supply chain issues. Mm-hmm. And so part of this has helped alleviate some of those because we were able to reuse our gas ERTs that had useful life on them as well.
Okay, that's great. You, in your testimony, also on page 5, you at on line 16, you explain that Northwestern customers have been requesting more from Northwestern Energy, including but not limited to outage communication and granular energy usage data. And that for Northwestern to continue meeting the customers' changing expectations, a new platform needs to be implemented, and that begins with the metering capabilities, correct?
That is correct.
There was an effort in the legislature to enact legislation that would allow customers to opt in to the metering program. Are you familiar with that at all?
I heard about it, but not directly involved.
And Northwestern didn't support the idea of allowing customers to opt in. Are you familiar with that position? Do you know why?
You know, there's a couple reasons that come to me. Being an engineer, and it's in my testimony, talked about the mesh network, and the mesh network's the most affordable network to deploy. It doesn't have large towers, and just has lower ongoing costs. And so, an opt-in program would force us to a different technology. So we'd be putting up large expensive towers or using cellular backhaul that has large expenses associated with it. And then the second reason too is, a lot of people don't, I don't want to say this, a lot of people would appreciate outage notifications. A lot of people have high bill complaints, right? And we want to be able to provide that customer experience on why was your bill high? Today, we only have monthly reads. If we have interval data, we could tell them exactly why their bill was high or what hours of the day that they're consuming a lot of energy so that they could maybe understand what's going on in their household.
Yes, I can see many advantages for the program. But what I'm trying to get at is if Northwestern had allowed customers to opt into the program, are you saying that you wouldn't have the high participation rate that you're having now?
I can't say whether we would have a high, it wasn't the course of action we did. I can say that I think we'd have a difficult time deploying a mesh network, and the customers who wanted an AMI network or an AMI meter, it would be difficult to serve them with a mesh technology.
And why wouldn't you be able to implement the mesh network if customers were given the opportunity to opt in?
The mesh network kind of relies on your neighbor's meter. So one meter hops in the next meter, hops in the next meter, hops in the next meter. And then we have a takeout point. Sometimes we can daisy chain that network up to 20 miles. And so if people are opting in and their neighbor chooses not to opt in, we might not be able to deliver that AMI meter to that rural customer.
Okay. So if it was an opt-in program, you probably wouldn't have as many customers opting in as you do now under the current program.
And I would also add that the customers who wanted to opt in, if we can't get a network to them, we can't offer that as a program. So it makes it very difficult to deploy that service to those customers.
Okay. On line, page 6, line 11, one of the reasons that you've given is that these will provide a strong foundation to manage future utility requirements. Can you just describe what you mean by future utility requirements?
I think it can mean a lot of different things, but I mean, a couple things off of my top of my head is, for example, our net metering customers being able to report how much generation is being put onto our system, right? That's a new requirement. We're able to capture how much generation is put onto our system through net or through these AMI meters is an example. But I mean, I could think of any, policy rates to be able to offer that flexibility moving forward.
Okay. I have just a clarification I'd like on page 7 of your testimony, it's on line 18. You're speaking about power line carrier technology, PLC technology.
Yep.
And you say their PLC technology may be used in instances where very remote electric meters are needed when the mesh network will not reach these meters. Do you mean may or will, or what do you mean by may in that sentence?
We're really trying to push this network to extend as far as possible. And so we're deploying and testing this out. And so some of the areas might struggle to reach. The mesh network might struggle to reach, and we'll need a power line carrier technology to reach that last amount. So, the use of may is just trying to, I guess, extend that mesh technology. It's not 100% certain. In a lot of cases, we have been able to remove power line carrier technology and extend the AMI mesh network and get good coverage.
Okay, so what you're saying is you will only use PLC if you have to?
Exactly.
Excuse me, Mr. President, just a moment while I review my notes. Yes, going to page 15 of your testimony. Lines 3 through 7. You mentioned that Northwestern will reduce field employees' workload, and you state that AMI meters will free field workers up to support other needs of Northwestern's electric and natural gas system customers, correct?
Correct.
What other needs will the field employees be supporting?
I think, our customer base is growing, right? And so with that comes more service calls. AMI has more alarms associated with it, right? So voltage or potential safety issues we have to respond to. Those could be potentially some other things. They might be redeployed on capital projects, as an example, versus expense-based maintenance work. So I think, there's several examples there that, field time is reduced on certain work orders, but it doesn't mean that those field workers are going away.
It's my understanding that the AMI meters, the system will require employees to monitor it as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you expect an increase overall in employees as a result of the metering program, or a decrease?
I want to kind of separate maybe, because this is kind of apples and oranges, right? So AMR is just kind of meter reading, right? You're providing one service, and that's to bill our customers on a monthly basis. AMI is a little different, where not only are you providing meter reading, but you're providing access to interval data, understanding your energy usage, collecting that data daily. And so I don't know if that's like an apples to apple comparison. I think that's a very difficult comparison to make, but there is going to be employees to operate the AMI net system, as well as field employees to service that too. And I can't project exactly what the outcomes will be.
Do you know if Northwestern Energy and by extension the ratepayers will be able to save money because of the AMI project? Will it cost the customers ultimately less in, like, for example, labor, or is it going to be a wash, or is the AMI project going to cost customers more?
Yeah, good question. If you go to page 16 of my testimony, it's, you do see a reduction in field service orders of a certain type, just like I said before, right? Mm-hmm. And we're also offering a different customer experience for that customer. We're providing outage notifications. And with that, I can't remember exactly what page it's on, but there's a reference example that, better outage notification reduces call volumes for the operation center too, right? And so you're kind of asking to predict that future, exactly what employees and what savings are going to be. And I think that's a hard prediction to make. I think the different story is, we're not just providing meter reading, but we're providing, a better customer experience for that customer too. And I can't say that, there's going to be, savings in a certain area, but there's also this foundation of network and technology that does add costs. You have employees to meet that. I can't say if it's a wash or not, or if there's some savings there, but I think the important note, it's again, the apples and oranges a little bit, where, it's not just about meter reading anymore. It's all the additional features of AMI.
I hear what you're saying. There's different benefits, but I'm curious about the actual costs of the AMI program versus the AMR program. Has there been a cost analysis of the relative costs of each of those types of programs?
I mean, I think, we haven't had a year to go look at historical costs or anything like that, because AMI is not fully deployed, right? And we have not done a detailed cost analysis, because the point being is we're selecting a different technology to read our meters and providing a different experience to our customers. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but it's a different level of service.
Okay. Would you please look at lines 7 through 14 of page 17 of your testimony? Do you see where you state the internal labor category consists of the project management, installation of networking equipment, software installation and configuration, and union labor to complete electric meter and natural gas module installations that the contractor was not able to finish?
Correct.
Okay. Why wasn't the contractor able to complete those installations?
A lot of times, meters are blocked. Someone put a deck around it, put it behind an enclosed or shrubs, or it's covered with snow, or there's a safety reason where they have bad dogs and they don't want to send their guys in. So we have to, it gets RTU'd back to us where we go take responsibility of that install to complete that install. And so we're not charged for that. RTU as an install, they get 3 attempts to try. And then we'll go ahead and complete that work. It's either a safety or most likely like a block meter.
Okay. So is there a specific reason why you don't just use another contractor and why you use union labor?
I think a lot of these have different issues around it. So it's not just about the meter replacement. A lot of them, I'll give a couple examples, is a lot of the RTUs are meter bases are coming off the building, right? And so it's not safe to install. And so we RTU that, we get an electrician to secure that meter base back to the wall, and then we replace that meter.
Okay. I'm looking now at page 18 of your direct testimony. And on page 18, you state that $52.6 million of investment associated with the AMI meter project are part of this rate review, correct?
That is correct.
Will the meter program, once complete, ultimately save Northwestern money?
I don't think that it's saving the customer as much as we can, right? And so we are trying to be as efficient as possible from an expense standpoint of how do we automate as much as we can, truck rolls reductions, things like that. But there are additional costs that come to support a new foundational technology, the network infrastructure to do that. And so I think like any project, there's a capital portion of that project. And then we're doing our best effort to reduce to drive that efficiency out of the AMI system for our customers.
Okay. So the meter project is not yet complete, correct?
That is correct.
Can you please explain how the commission can find a partially completed project a prudent investment without knowing the benefits and costs of the total AMI deployment project?
I think we pointed out our estimated total to you guys, right? The $125 million in my testimony on JRS 18, line 9. So you do know the expected cost of the project. I think the benefits, we're under an asset issue. We have to replace assets. We thought it was prudent to move forward with AMI technology to deliver that enhanced customer experience on outage notifications and interval data. So I'm not sure, does that answer? Do you want to restate that question?
Well, a little less than half of the project is completed at this point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're only requesting revenue requirement for that portion that's been completed. So is that portion that's completed, is that up and running and it's basically standalone? It's not reliant on the rest of the project being implemented? That's
correct. So Missoula and Butte are completely installed, operating on the AMI network. As soon as an AMI meter is installed, it registers with the network within a day and it's used and useful. So all that equipment's used and useful as soon as it is installed.
Okay, good. And just one more question for you. And this has to do with on page 22 of your testimony. This is your direct testimony on lanes 7 and 8. You state that utilities could use AMI data to provide flexible rate options, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you please describe what type of flexible rate options Northwestern could use the AMI data to provide?
You know, I think it's the power of interval data, right? And so interval data provides basically, you know, the flexibility to do different things. And so, I mean, you could look at I think you guys would probably know this better than me. I'm not in rate making, but special EV rates or different rate options. And I'll probably defer to Cindy Fang on exactly what rate options are out there or what the future looks like in the rate industry. As an engineer, I'm confident that the AMI system can provide the data to support any type of those rate options from a demand perspective to an interval consumption perspective.
Is that aspect of the project in play now, or is that something that you anticipate in the future?
I think that's a future discussion item.
Thank you, Mr. President. That's all.
Thank you, Vice President Fielder. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you. What is the youngest AMR meter that you have right now? When's the last time new ones were ordered?
I think we stopped ordering new AMI meters in
AMR.
I mean, yeah, AMR meters and I'd have to ask, but 2021 or 2022, 2021, I believe, is when we stopped ordering AMR, unless it's a specific form factor that we couldn't recycle.
So several of them are fairly new.
Yep.
Just beginning of their 20-year life. So if how many meters does Northwestern have, gas and electric combined?
I think it's around 530,000 is what I have in here.
Okay. So if 1% of the people opted out, then that would mean that the company would have to buy and deploy 5,000 AMI meters. Is that fair?
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I would just gently remind the commission that this is an open docket regarding opt-out in particular, just as a caution before we go too far down that path.
Thank you. I was looking at the expense of the whole program. You mentioned about refurbishment of AMRs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when they're at the end of their life, is that to the point that they cannot be refurbished anymore?
I would say that is beyond their useful life, and it would be prudent for us to replace that meter. We don't operate things until they're in failure mode. And so, you know, if it was taken out and removed and then, you know, over 19 years old, we'd probably install a new one.
I understand, but what does refurbishment mean then?
We're just reusing them. We test them in the meter shop, make sure they meet.
You're not taking them apart and redoing inner works. Oh, okay. I see what you mean. And in terms of the program that it's already deployed in Missoula and Butte, you say people can they can find out about their interval usage. Is that automated or is that with personnel?
We're working on automating that as we speak. Right now, it's a personnel that will take that down.
So it's intended to be somebody can log on and look at their own usage on the computer. And okay,
correct. That's where we're heading towards.
More efficient. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Commissioner Panucci.
No questions, Mr. President.
Commissioner Bukacek.
No questions, Mr. President.
I have no questions for this witness, Mr. Hamilton.
No questions.
We had no party that did cross, but I'm going to give everybody the opportunity to ask cross based on Vice President Fielder's questioning. All right, seeing none, would you like to redirect?
I have very, very brief redirect. Mr. Schaefer, you talked about and something being RTU'd back. Can you just explain that a little bit and give us the vocabulary?
RTU means return to utility. So.
And then the only other question I have for you is, as you were discussing with Commissioner Fielder, the personnel that will be responding to alarms, I thought it might be useful for you to provide an example, either a temperature alarm, a voltage alarm. What does that look like? And do you have any actual examples of where field personnel have responded and had a good customer experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, we've had several examples of high temp alarms come in, and we've deployed a field guy to remove the meter. A lot of times it's behind the meter. You can't see it visually. You can't really see anything's wrong until the meter's removed. And there were some bad connections in between the meter jaw and the base, and got an electrician right away to respond to make sure that service stays reliable. And that usually happens when there's high load. And so usually it's, at night when people have electric heat cranked on or something like that. So preventing those outages for customers is as a result of, AMI temp alarms. I know right now we looked at interval data for net generation just for where AMI deployed, and we've already contacted several customers that their solar system wasn't working. Or the installer had it set up wrong, so it wasn't exporting energy onto our system, and they were unaware that it wasn't working properly. And so they appreciated that feedback and that customer service provided by Northwestern Energy.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Hunt?
We would like to permanently excuse Mr. Schaefer.
Any objection to permanently excusing Mr. Schaefer? Seeing none, Schaefer, you're permanently excused. Thank you for coming today. Your next witness.
Thank you. Northwestern would call Crystal Lale back to the stand.
All right. Good afternoon, Ms. Lale. I'll just remind you, you're under continuing oath.
Ready, Ms. Lale?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead, Ms. Hill.
Could you state your name and business address for the record?
My name is Crystal Lail, CRYSTALLAIL, business address 3010 West 69th Street, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, 57108.
By whom are you employed?
I'm employed by Northwestern Energy.
And what is your title with Northwestern?
It's already afternoon. Vice President and Chief Financial Officer.
Did you file pre-filed testimony in this docket?
Yes, I did.
Do you have that testimony before you?
Yes.
And is that testimony marked as pre-filed direct testimony of Crystal D. Lale and pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Crystal D. Lale?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections to your testimony?
I do not.
Mr. Chairman, I move to admit the pre-filed direct testimony of Ms. Lale as NWE Exhibit 36.
Any objection to admission of NWE 36? Seeing none, NWE 36 is admitted.
Mr. Chairman, I move to admit the pre-filed rebuttal testimony of Ms. Lale as NWE Exhibit 37.
Any objection to the admission of NWE 37? Seeing none, NWE 37 is admitted.
Mr. Chairman, I tender this witness for cross-examination.
Okay. Mr. Brown? No questions, thank you. Mr. Nelson? Captain Duffy? Ms. Trinnell?
Thanks, President Brown. And I want to just be mindful of the advice or caution you had given me previously. A lot of what I had wanted to ask we covered before. So I just have a couple of questions.
Excellent.
Crystal, What does Northwestern tell Moody's about how it plans for climate change?
So when we meet with each of the credit ratings agencies, they walk through quantitative and qualitative factors. It's primarily a quantitative discussion of our FFO to debt metrics. On the qualitative side, they do consider risks related to the business. Those are not limited to climate change. They're broad risks across the operational factors. Specifically, they look at our portfolio and any risks that may incur to both Northwestern and its customers.
So that was pretty general. Does Northwestern advise Moody's specifically about anything, how it addresses climate change within Montana?
I would not characterize that we advise Moody's on their determinations of risk of the business. And I think somewhere in my testimony is specifically a report from Moody's that talks about how they consider our risk. You know, one of the things that they talk about is any variable generation. So they talk about hydro assets, wind, solar, the ability to produce, not produce, risks that may expose to. But broadly, we do not advise them on climate.
Do you consider climate change a risk for Northwestern?
We consider a broad section of risks, including climate. And I think if you look at our risk factors we disclose, there's a lot of them when it comes to operating a utility.
And I'd like to just ask you a little bit about regulatory lag as you talk about it in your testimony. Or do you want to look at that, or you remember that?
Fire away and I'll see if I need to reference.
Okay. How can you tell us, and in the last two rate cases being 2009 and 2018, Northwestern had made an initial application, received an interim, and then there was a final settlement or order.
Yes.
And in both of the previous cases, the initial application was much higher than the interim, which was higher than the final result in the final order or settlement. Can you tell us how Northwestern is harmed by regulatory lag?
Sure.
Given those prior two cases.
Try to put it in a nutshell. Obviously, I ended up with lengthy testimony on this issue. And I think you had a conversation with Dr. Dismukes last week too, and your characterization of regulatory lag being the time, as I took your comments and the ones you just made, being between when we file and interim rates and that ultimate outcome. What I'm talking about with regulatory lag is multifaceted in the sense of it's between cases. And even when we file a case, for instance, the current case, the rate base amount that is included for recovery does not reflect our actual total assets and service because of the averaging used. That's a significant factor to regulatory lag. So when you're asking the question with regard to the timing between filing and interim, and then ultimately rates being in place, my comments with regard to regulatory lag are much broader than that. You see many jurisdictions using a forecast test period, and that ultimately would be a significant reduction of regulatory lag because you would be talking about costs currently being incurred versus right now we're talking about 2021 and in a high inflationary environment in the last 18 months. This case does not remotely pull in all the costs we're currently incurring. That's the issues with regulatory lag that our filing comprehensively look to address between a variety of mechanisms. I think that's detailed out in my testimony.
But you have total control over when you file a rate case, correct?
Generally, I would agree with that statement, yes.
Okay. Now, in this case, if you can look at the settlement, but I think you've been listening. If you add up the electric in the settlement agreement, if you add up the 82, the 18 from the gas and the 69 and the PCAM, that's $169 million if the settlement agreement is accepted, right?
I think that's the math we went over a lot, but yes.
Okay. And then you've also, so that's in front of the commission. If the commission rejects the settlement, they can go through the application and make assessments about what's in, what's out there, correct?
That's fair.
Okay. And I do have some questions about some of those line items, but I was going to ask Ms. Rich about those. Would she be the better witness for those?
If they're detailed revenue requirement questions, Ms. Rich is absolutely the best witness for that. If they're high level settlement questions or broad costs, I can take a shot at it or I can pass them off.
Maybe I'll ask a question and you can pass if that seems appropriate. Is that fair?
That's fair.
Okay. So I want to ask about advertising costs as set out in the revenue requirements. Can you point us anywhere in the record that is in front of this commission where the advertising costs that you're requesting, which as I read the spreadsheets are just under $1 million, are narrowly tailored to fall within the statutory prohibition that they are only to be for the specific allowed purposes?
Ms. Rich can give you the specifics, but I can tell you that I am aware that in the revenue requirement, we only include safety and the efficiency, that type of advertising, and that we adjust or pull out anything that we would consider image advertising, and that's not included in the case. Ms. Rich can give you the specific details.
Okay, and that's where I'm struggling a little bit is I don't see the line item breakout and where the commission can make a decision, which is ultimately the commission's decision that
Right.
falls.
I don't know if there was a data request on that, but typically what we would do is exclude that before we ever file.
Okay, I'll follow up with Ms. Rich. And then the second category of questions that I just wanted to ask generally about is executive compensation. Is that something you could maybe address on a higher level?
Yes.
Okay. So the settlement is 169. The initial application is 102. The rebuttal is 105. And then with the gas, it's more than that. The large customer group had recommended deductions for executive bonuses and compensation of about $5.5 million on the electric side and about $2 million on the gas side. Does that sound about right to you? Or
I don't know the amounts off the top of my head, but I wouldn't characterize it as executive compensation. That was broad-based compensation that their adjustment was related to.
And to be fair, they had broken them out in 3 separate groups: income-based, incentive compensation, stock-based compensation for non-executives, and stock-based for board of directors.
Yes, that's fair.
Okay. So in those 3 categories, the large customer group deduction on the electric side was around 5.5, and on the gas side was around 2. Does that sound right? And I'm not asking you
I hate
for
to say the word subject to check, but I'm gonna say them. I think subject to check, that sounds roughly correct.
And my question isn't about the specific amounts. It's really, and then the Consumer Council had also made some recommendations about deductions in their testimony.
Correct.
Okay. So would you accept that the Consumer Council's recommendations and the large customers were roughly in the same neighborhood, about 5 million on the electric side and about 2 on the gas side in those 3 categories of?
That sounds in the neighborhood.
Okay. So if the commission rejected the settlement agreement and looked at your initial application of 102 on the electric side, one of the things the commission would have in front of it for consideration would be that deduction of about $5 million for those 3 categories of expenses, right?
I think there was, and certainly my rebuttal testimony addresses specifically why we believe those are reasonable and recoverable costs, and the importance of obviously attracting a talented workforce and paying them a market wage. But yes, that was one of the things that we differed in viewpoint on.
Yeah, fair enough. But the point being that the commission would have in front of it some advocacy for keeping it in or taking it out if it rejects a settlement.
There's testimony from multiple parties on that regard.
And I don't think I have any more questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. No. HRC. Mr. Uda.
No questions.
Noble Northwest. May I see?
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Lael. Jenny Harbeim for Montana Environmental Information Center. It's good to see you again.
Good afternoon.
Is mitigating financial risk part of your job at Northwestern?
Yes.
And would you say that mitigating financial risk is a component of prudent utility management?
Yes.
Is pre-approval of a large new generating asset less financially risky for Northwestern than investing in building that asset and later seeking to include it in the rate base?
Yes.
Okay, speaking specifically about the Yellowstone plant, what is the risk to Northwestern if the commission denies the company's request, presumably its forthcoming request, to put that plant in rate base until after it is built?
I would state the risk in a variety of ways. We've talked about regulatory lag. So there's the risk of that asset being in service. And if customers are receiving the benefit and costs are not being recovered, that would be a significant financial risk and certainly would cause us to significantly under-earn our authorized rate of return in this case, depending upon outcome. The risk also, so investors obviously are looking for you to earn your authorized return. If there were a longer period, the question would be, does that become a merchant asset, something like that? There's a lot of risks associated with that.
Well, and there's also the risk that the commission could decline to include the asset and rate base. Is that correct?
Certainly.
Okay, and what would the impact to Northwestern be of that decision if it were to occur?
I can't predict the outcome at the time or the impact at the time. It would be a facts and circumstances assessment at the time of what were the reasons and what would be the next steps from there.
Is it fair to say, though, it would leave the company with a large financial liability that it's not recovering from customers?
I think that's fair. And we would obviously have to look at options for receiving value for that asset.
Okay. Would that also create some risk for Northwestern's customers?
I think not having that facility, you've heard other witnesses, the operational risk and being able to serve, the obligation to serve. That's certainly why we're proceeding with the facility. And we think it's significant risk for our customers. And we've talked about the amount of increase in this case that on the pass-through cost is far more. The supply side is far more than what we earn on, the base part of that bill. So the risk to customers, you've seen volatility of markets, I think is outsized as long as there aren't assets that are at a cost that this commission agrees upon when you're on the market and it's volatile. We talked about $900 a megawatt hour. That's a significant risk to customers and ultimately the absolute ability to keep the lights on and serve.
Okay. And in addition to what I think you called operational risk, could there be some risk to customers based on the potential financial impairment to the company if the Yellowstone asset is not rate-based?
I think there's a lot of discussion, and certainly in my testimony, on the broader financial health of the utility and the importance of that financial health to be able to withstand shocks to the system. And we've seen quite a few of them in the last couple of years between the pandemic and Winter Storm Uri and the frequency and volatility and the latest banking crisis. So overall, certainly it's, as you alluded to earlier, my job to think about those things and make sure that we can continue to serve customers. You've seen several of our neighbor utilities see very significant liquidity impacts in the last few months. The ability to withstand that is critical. Obviously, the outcome to Yellowstone and any impacts there is significant to us.
Thank you. Based on your answers, is it fair to say that Northwestern's decision to forgo pre-approval of the Yellowstone plant increased risks to the company and its ratepayers?
I would suggest that decision was balancing the risks, and the risks we saw with repricing those contracts, which would provide value to customers, the risks we saw with not going ahead and bringing that asset online, and the original targeted, which would be operational risks, literally the obligation to serve, balanced with the financial risks.
Okay, I want to get into those risks a little bit, but I want to step back and ask you some questions about the timeline from the pre-approval docket. Northwestern filed its application for pre-approval of what it then called the Laurel Generating Station in May of 2021. Does that sound right to you?
Yes.
Are you aware of any deadline for the commission to act on such an application?
I believe there's a statutory deadline. I don't know off the top of my head what it is.
Okay. Does 270 days sound about right to you?
Sounds fair.
Okay. And do you know how, where on the calendar 270 days from Northwestern's application would fall?
I assume if we filed in May that you'd be early into the following year.
Okay. Are you aware that the commission had scheduled a hearing in that pre-approval docket to commence in January of 2022?
Yes.
And so as far as you know, the commission was on track to meet its statutory deadline?
Yes.
Do you remember the date on which Northwestern withdrew its application for pre-approval of the now named Yellowstone plant?
I believe it was in the fall. I don't know the date off the top of my head.
My records reflect September 21st, 2021.
That sounds right.
Okay. Earlier in the hearing, you testified that Northwestern withdrew the pre-approval application because it needed to provide a notice to proceed with construction to maintain contracted rates. I think I wrote that down accurately, but is that a fair summary of your earlier testimony?
I think that's fair.
Is that the only reason that Northwestern withdrew its application for pre-approval?
The significant driver there was we needed to either proceed with the contracts as they were and issue notice to proceed. I think we all know in late 2021 what was going on with the not so transitory inflation. And we had seen another plant we had proposed in South Dakota because we had not locked pricing, had essentially doubled. And we walked away from that plant. So the decision was we need to issue notice to proceed and we need to move forward while this hearing was moving forward or the docket was moving forward in its stated timeline from the perspective of what was unprecedented inflation and unprecedented change in the marketplace for those types of services that had been consistent for years before that to coming out of the COVID pandemic and that world being completely different. And our suppliers basically saying, either you move forward now or we're moving on. That was the decision we had in front of us, and considering the operational risks and then ultimately the cost to customers of if we repriced that facility and allowed those contracts to reprice, what that would cost. We made the very difficult decision to, as you alluded to, accept additional financial risk due to the customer impact that we saw if we didn't move forward with construction.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand because Northwestern had a contract for the construction of the Yellowstone plant and a contracted price, correct?
That contract was subject to quite a few provisions, including timing and notice to proceed.
Do you know when the deadline in the contract was for the unconditional notice to proceed?
Mr. Hines would have been a better witness to ask that to, but my recollection is it was by the end of that year. End of 21, to clarify what years we're in, before hearing would have occurred.
Okay, so you would be surprised if Northwestern's testimony in the contract itself provided an April 1st deadline for an unconditional notice to proceed?
I'm probably not the right witness, as I alluded to.
Mr. Chairman, if Ms. Harbine wants to ask questions about a contract, perhaps we could put it in front of the witness.
I think that's a fair statement. Sorry, how do you respond?
I would like the witness to respond whether that is a surprise to her. And if it is, I can dig through the discovery and pull out that contract.
Well, I think Ms. Harbine, it would be fair to the witness for her to have that contract in front of her.
Okay, let me proceed with my questions, and then I will pull out either the contract or Northwestern's application in that pre-approval docket. Does that sound fair?
With the comment that I am not the witness with the most knowledge of the contract.
Okay, fair enough. I do have some other questions unrelated to the deadline for the unconditional notice. Is it your testimony that Northwestern would have been somehow prohibited from commencing construction or providing a notice to proceed while the pre-approval docket was still pending?
It's my general understanding, again, not the expert on this, is that to be moving forward with material construction, you're no longer in pre-approval. And that's the way I would simply state it.
And I'm not asking you to provide any legal analysis here, but on what are you basing that general understanding?
Again, conversations at the time when making that decision, we were making the hard decision of how can you have a pre-approval docket versus actually moving forward with having CAT begin making the turbines, beginning the construction work with the vendors there. That my general understanding is you would be in a very difficult spot to say that you're still pre-approving and waiting for the commission to make a determination when you are indeed moving forward with the vendors.
Okay, so your understanding is based on conversations you had at the time and your understanding of just the word pre-approval?
My understanding of the statute and rules around that type of proceeding, yes, as explained to me.
Okay. Yet, if your understanding about the notice of intent deadline is correct, that means that Northwestern would have commenced a pre-approval proceeding with a deadline beyond the notice to proceed deadline, if your deadline of the end of the year is correct.
Objection. This is a little confusing and asking for clarification. There were multiple contracts and notices to proceed. So that's why it's important to know what contract we're talking
about. Okay, thank you. I'm talking about the Burns and McDonald contract. The Burns and McDonald contract. And Mr. President, if you'd like to pause for a couple minutes, I can find that and circulate it.
And to clarify, my responses were primarily driven by the Caterpillar contract and our need to proceed with their construction of the turbines. So I do think we're talking probably about different things.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, I think this provides a good opportunity for us to take why don't we take a 12-minute break? We'll come back at 3:05. Time's now 2:54. And we will go off the record. All right, time is now 3:05 p.m. We are back on the record. We as the commission have not received what is going to be asked of Ms. Lael, so we're sort of waiting for that. Let's do a couple of procedural housekeeping matters. Mr. Brown, I think you wanted to put something on the record.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Due to a commitment tomorrow morning, I was just going to ask that I be excused until approximately 9:30 a.m. And you can, I will certainly catch up on the transcript later on.
All right, I see that as being a problem, Mr. Brown. It's your case. And then there was a request for Dr. Roy. You want to discuss that at this time?
Yes, Mr. President, Dr. Roy was originally on the schedule for Renewable Northwest. First thing tomorrow, I realize we're a little bit out of order, but if you could still accommodate him first thing, that's what works best for him.
Is there any objection to that accommodation? Okay, well, we'll go ahead and put him on first thing. We will be starting tomorrow at 8:30, so we'll put him on it.
Okay, and just to clarify, we will be doing our opening directly before he testifies.
All right, you just might want to make him aware that his testimony might be interrupted with public comment, please.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I guess at this time, Ms. Harmon, have you provided the contracts, plural, to Ms. Lael?
I emailed the parties and Mr. Hamilton 3 documents, the third of which is a completely irrelevant EPA document that I'll ask you to disregard. I'm attempting to download the CAT contract, but we can proceed by talking about the burns and here it is. One moment.
Mr. Chairman, Northwestern objects to questions on contracts that are not in this docket. They were not provided in response to a data request and that I know of, and not provided as part of witness testimony. And Ms. Lael certainly hasn't testified about them, and she's indicated her lack of knowledge about them.
I'll disagree that Ms. Lael hasn't testified about them. She cited as the reason for Northwestern's withdrawal of its pre-approval application, the need to provide notices of proceed to certain contractors. So I want to correct or clarify the record with respect to what those contracts provide to ensure we're all on the same page about the rationale for this important decision.
So
I'll let you rule, Mr. Chairman, but we still don't have the contracts in our email either.
Well, that's a different matter. I'm going to override the objection at this point in time. I would just say, Ms. Hill, that at this point in time, Northwestern Energy has not formally withdrawn the reliability rider in this docket, and so this is still a live issue at this point.
Okay. I'll ask somebody to give me a knowing look when those documents do appear. They've come. Okay. Let me proceed with just a slightly different line of questioning before we get to the contracts, and hopefully they will appear in everyone's emails. Do you know when intervener testimony was due to be filed in the Laurel Generating Station pre-approval docket?
No.
Do you know if it was filed before Northwestern withdrew its application for pre-approval?
No.
Okay. Would you have reviewed any intervener testimony if it had been filed? in the normal course of things in your participation in dockets such as this?
Typically, I review, and I did not have testimony in that document. Typically, if it's something related to me, I review it. I will not say that I review all of the intervener testimony in any given docket.
Do you recall reviewing any intervener testimony in the Laurel Generating Station pre-approval docket?
I do not.
Okay. Well, I don't think we need to necessarily rely on your memory.
That's
I
good.
believe the court can take judicial notice of its procedural order in that pre-approval docket, which provided an October 1st deadline for intervener testimony, which I'll note is less than 2 weeks after Northwestern withdrew its application.
Objection, counsel's testifying.
The council is testifying. Are you asking us to take judicial notice of
the deadlines? Yes, I would request judicial notice of the deadlines contained in the commission's procedural order in the Laurel Generating Station pre-approval docket, which was number 2021.02.022.
Yes, we'll take judicial notice of our own scheduling order. We won't take notice of the testimony that accompanied that judicial notice. Go ahead.
Were you aware of the filing of any responses by interveners in response to Northwestern's notice of withdrawal of the pre-approval request for the Laurel Generating Station?
No.
Okay. But as far as you know, did interveners have an opportunity to share their expert analysis with the commission with respect to the prudence of the Laurel Generating Station in that docket?
Objection, asked and answered. The attorney is now starting to testify again.
I'm going to overrule that. Go ahead and answer if you remember what the question was.
I don't. Could you repeat it, please?
Hold on. Can you just read back the question?
I don't know.
Okay. Has Ms. Hill, have you received the emails from Ms. Norcutt? Okay. I apologize for the clunky nature of this. It doesn't help that the contract is not searchable, so give me just 1 second. Mr. President, may I approach to share a document with the witness?
You may.
Mr. Chairman, could we take a minute to, I'm not sure if these contracts are confidential. I believe that they might be, but I need to double check before.
Yes, with that stated, absolutely. We will, why don't we take 10 more minutes? We will go. So time is now 3:14. We will reconvene at 3:25. Go off the record. Before I go on record here, just so, well, time's now 3:15. We're going to go back on the record. So that was the quickest break ever. Does the witness actually have a copy of these in front of her at this time? Okay, so you're going to present her a copy via the computer. All right. I think it would probably be advisable for us to screen share this document.
Okay, the first document that I want to reference is in my second email that begins with the apology for the inadvertent first email. And that is that what I'll represent is the CAT contract. And Mr. Hamilton, I'll be referencing page 4 at the outset.
Make sure we're not sharing any confidential information at this time.
If it helps, I think it was attached as JLW-2 to the direct testimony of Williams.
Before you testify on this document, can you confirm, Ms. Hill, this page 4 is not confidential?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, as Ms. Harbon noted, it's an exhibit to previous testimony in another docket.
Okay.
Are we ready here? Okay. Ms. Lael, does this look like the CAT contract that you referenced earlier in your testimony?
Yes, I believe it is.
Okay. Can you look at the bottom of page 3, paragraph B? What does the term FNTP mean?
FNTP is defined here in the contract as collectively full notice to proceed.
Okay. Will you please scroll down to the next page, page 4, and read the first sentence of paragraph C?
Northwestern does not anticipate issuing a FNTP until the project is approved by the Montana Public Service Commission and agrees to provide seller with periodic updates on the status of the regulatory proceedings.
Thank you. In the first email that I sent to Counsel for All Parties is Northwestern's application in the pre-approval docket. We'll get that in front of you, Ms. Lael. And I'm looking at page 235 of the PDF.
I'm there.
Okay, I apologize. Please go to page 236 of the PDF and read the sentence that begins on line 8 with the contract stipulates.
The contract stipulates the NTP must be granted on or before April 1st, 2022.
Okay, and NTP means notice to proceed?
Appears to be.
Okay, and is this referencing the Burns and McDonnell contract?
Yes, it appears to be referencing the Burns McDonnell contract.
Okay. So to recap what we just covered, Northwestern was contractually obligated to Burns and McDonnell to provide a notice to proceed on or before April 1st, 2022, correct?
That's what this says.
And no deadline for providing a notice to proceed to Caterpillar?
I would not say that's correct based on my understanding.
Okay. And based on what you just reviewed in the contract with Caterpillar, did you see any deadline? I suppose you haven't read I retract that question because you have not read the full contract. But based on what we just read, the contract indicated that Northwestern did not anticipate providing a notice to proceed until after the pre-approval docket was completed, correct?
Again, I haven't read the whole contract, but I do know the management decision that was made at the time was heavily influenced by the conversations with CAT and the need to proceed with their manufacturing of the turbines.
Okay. But it's fair to say that Northwestern was aware, at least as of the date of the commission's procedural order in that pre-approval docket, that the hearing would not even commence until January, correct?
Yes.
Yet it waited until September to withdraw its application for pre-approval.
I think if you all recall the summer of 2021, things changed dramatically in that market. And as we came out of COVID, inflation, supply chain, all of a sudden became a significant issue on all of our radars. And the conversations with CAT and what was going on in Europe heavily influenced our decision to pull the pre-approval application and proceed with CAT beginning to manufacture that equipment. That was the basis of the discussion.
And that's because of Northwestern's understanding or your understanding that construction couldn't proceed simultaneously with a pre-approval docket.
Again, those would be questions for council, but I can speak to the management determination. And in assessing that, the key component was needing to move forward with material construction of those turbines and what was going on in Europe and supply chain and all the above to keep our spot, to be able to maintain construction timeline of the facility, to have it online in a reasonable time and at a reasonable cost.
Okay. No further questions. Thank you for your indulgence.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Harmon. All right. Commissioner questions, Vice President Fielder.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Lael, I have a few questions for you. In your pre-filed direct testimony, you provided some reports from Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, the credit reports that were, I believe, fairly current at that time. This was nearly a year ago. Specifically, those were exhibits CDL4, CDL5, and CDL6, correct?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Okay. And according to these reports and exhibits, Moody's outlook for Northwestern Energy at that time was stable with a Baa2 rating.
Yes.
S&P's outlook was stable with a BBB rating. It's all uppercase B's. I guess there's a difference between the lowercase B's and the uppercase B's, correct?
Indeed, there is.
And Fitch's outlook was stable with a all caps BBB rating.
Yes.
Correct. Okay. Is this your current understanding of Northwestern's credit ratings?
Yes, those ratings remain the same today.
So since you filed your direct testimony in this rate case, there's been several rate increases that have been received by Northwestern, including the gas and electric base revenue requirements, the interim increase to the PCAM base cost, the recovery of PCAM under collections in the PCAM tracker, and recovery of property taxes in the property tax tracker. Have these increases improved your funds from operation or FFO to debt ratio, which you reference in your rebuttal testimony?
Yes, so my rebuttal testimony updates it to some degree. And you mentioned the interim rate determination, which was very significant for us from a cash flow perspective and what contributes to that formula, which says basically you take your cash flow from operations less working capital compared to your debt, and you get your FFO to debt. So we just met with Moody's here in March. We meet with them every year, the credit ratings agency. And from a 2022 perspective, we had expected to see an improvement in our qualitative or quantitative metrics. And unfortunately, they did not. We were at 12.6%. Our downgrade threshold is 14%. So while we saw constructive decision from the commission from an interim rate perspective and began to, you think you began billing that October 1st, you begin to see those cash flows in mid-November. We also saw continuing volatility in the supply market. And certainly in December, we experienced, you heard from the supply folks, over $900 a megawatt hour we were purchasing at. So cash came in, that was great. Cash went back out the door. And so that helped us tread water a bit, but we didn't see improvement in our FFO as of the end of 2022. Our conversations, though, with the ratings agencies just here in the last month or so were stick with us a little bit longer. We believe we have a path forward. They always look at our forecast metrics. We showed where we think we're going to go, and importantly, where we believe the groundwork that was laid in the interim proceeding, and certainly a constructive outcome in this case, i.e. the settlement, would support our FFO improving to be above the downgrade threshold over time.
Okay, so there was a lot in that answer. Thank you. So I just want to parse it out a little bit. So what would you say has been the response then of the credit rating agencies to the increases that you have received?
I would certainly tell you that being below our downgrade thresholds from a quantitative math perspective, had we not had a constructive decision on interim, so the qualitative and quantitative, right, and showing a legitimate path to improving that metric, I think those conversations would have been very different.
In a negative way?
In a negative way, absolutely.
So you see the no change as somewhat positive?
Indeed. And I think my recollection, we've talked about it already today. Sometimes it's good and sometimes it isn't. But since then, one or two of the agencies gave a brief update to our annual meetings with them and basically said they're pending further review to the outcome of this case and seeing a final order.
I see that in the exhibit that you submitted from Moody's anyway. Okay, more specifically, and I know you started to touch on this, but in the reports provided and your pre-filed direct testimony, you speak to factors influencing these ratings, such as lack of timely cost recovery, current design of the PCAM, and lack of revenue adjustment mechanisms. Could you speak to these concerns you identified in specific relationship to the settlement and how it may or may not relieve some of these pressures?
So I'll speak to them. I'll try to speak to them in turn. So one, a settlement that provides some degree of a base increase, which we've talked about here. The numbers related to that is a key outcome. And the credit ratings agencies are looking for something that's credit supportive in the sense of how's capital structure determined, what's the ROE that's awarded, and what are the key adjustments in getting to that settled revenue requirement. And so I think this settlement, as we've talked about, represents a fair balance between the interveners' cases and our cases, and balances the impact to customers, which also credit rating agencies think about in the sense of ability to pay, all encompassing on an overall perspective related to our base rates. Then the additional pieces of that of what's credit supportive, adjusting the PCAM base is really significant in the sense of what we've seen of outsized impact to our customers and unfortunately their bill of what market price purchases have been. So getting a base that we think more reflects current market is a significant change and certainly credit supportive. The other aspect of that that's also credit supportive is changing that deferred balance. Currently, that's an annual update to when that rolls through to customers. And you can see that in the bill impact statements as to impact to customers of costs from 18 months ago rolling through currently. Credit rating agencies certainly will view in the settlement the movement to a quarterly adjustment of what's sitting as that deferred. So impacting our cash flows, we've already paid whoever the generator is for that power, but not seeing those cash flows come back from customers. That will certainly be seen as credit supportive. The other elements with regard to future recovery. So we talk about the riders in turn. So the reliability rider, certainly we agreed to something less than a full rider that the credit rating agencies always view as very credit supportive, which is when an asset begins serving customers, if you can recover it at that time, that's the best credit quality. If you can reach some sort of agreement like we've reached here with the settling parties to provide some recovery for what will be operating costs at the time that it begins serving customers, I believe they'll see that as credit supportive. On the fire rider, certainly we ask for operating and capital costs. On the operating side, we've agreed to a deferral mechanism, so we get some ability to not have as much of an earnings impact. That's not as credit supportive because we're not getting cash flows at the time, but certainly a part of give and take overall. And then stepping back from the BT rider. So it's a mix, but I also think the credit rating agencies look at the package as a whole to see what they believe to be credit supportive, and will assess it in the sense of a broader outcome. And is that reasonable based off what they've seen in regulatory cases?
So if you can't answer this or shouldn't answer this, it's fine. I'm just going to ask, can you tell us what your beliefs are in terms of how this rate case will influence Northwestern's credit ratings?
I can give you an opinion. So I'll do that. I think the settlement is constructive as we've reached with the parties that signed onto that. And I think the rating agencies will view it favorably. It's a good step forward in the sense of regulatory construct. And then they'll be looking for us to lay out what are the next steps and where do we go from here. But I certainly think they'll view it as credit supportive.
Can you speak to the importance of a financially healthy utility and the resulting impact to customers?
Absolutely. And I realized my direct testimony was rather long-winded on that topic. But at the highest level, a financially healthy utility, we need to invest in the system. And there's a critical amount of investment. And you would see our track record of investing. We are investing in excess of depreciation, and the ability to bring that investment to Montana dictated by the need to keep the lights on and the gas flowing. A financially healthy utility. And when I say investing in excess of depreciation, in other words, you're growing rate base and you require additional capital to do so. So maintaining financial health to attract that capital is critical. I also would point to significant impacts to the system and our obligation to serve. In the last 3 years, it seems like every time I turn around, we get an event that reminds me of our need to be financially healthy. When I say that, the pandemic, the beginning of that, we went out and got liquidity, a term loan, because we and everyone had a huge amount of unknown as to what was ahead of us. But critical to what we all do is the service we provide. And so we went and got liquidity. When I say went and got liquidity, we pulled down a $100 million term loan. Why do we do that? Because we didn't know if customers were going to be able to pay bills. We didn't know what the impacts in the market would be, if credit would seize up. It was a very unknown time. For us to be able to seek liquidity, we have to be financially healthy. Same thing when Winter Storm Uri happened. You saw multiple utilities have to get term loans that were outsized in relative impact to their normal debt amounts to serve customers. So we were much more impacted in South Dakota and Nebraska at the time, but we were paying $200, $300 gas. How can you buy gas at that price? Well, you have to have credit. And we have to be able to fully backstop, and our balance sheet has to be able to withstand those sorts of shocks. So that occurred in Winter Storm Uri. Since then, we've seen multiple times where our balance sheet has had to go out and support whatever the market prices were to keep the lights on. In December, the supply team would tell you that's over $900 a megawatt hour. So financially healthy with liquidity capacity means something to your customers because when you go get that liquidity, you're going to pay a credit spread on it. So you have a treasury rate they're usually priced at, and then you have spreads compared to that. And that essentially is an indicator of your financial health. And ultimately, you're going to pass that on to customers. So it affects customers in both A, can you go out and buy the supply you need? Can your balance sheet withstand that? And can you get the credit to support it? And at what price? And then most recently, to make the new CFO close the loop on fun things I should learn, we've had a banking crisis. And we were in the market doing a debt deal at the time. And I can tell you, investment grade credit absolutely matters because the investment grade credit market was still open. I would not say that was the case for non-investment grade. So in trying to sum up lots of pages that I put in here as to why I think it matters to be a financially healthy utility, it's always, will the liquidity or what you need be there? And at what price? And ultimately, there's lag to when that comes into rate making and how that may impact customers. But that first obligation to serve is what will it take to keep the lights on and be able to provide that? We think about that a lot. But then secondly, this creditworthiness and financial health backstops the ability to get it when you need it and at what price.
You, Mr. President.
Thank you, Vice President Fielder. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you. Thank you. In reading the Moody's and the other guys, they were talking about one of the effects upon the company's credit rating is, and I forget the exact word, like adverse or difficult regulatory treatment by the Montana Public Service Commission. Does this case or the stipulation, does it really satisfy any of their misgivings relative to the way this commission is treating your company?
Yes, I think the issues that the credit rating agencies were pointing to was things like COVID deferral and where we went with that docket and prior disallowances versus the difference in this settlement is, I think they would look at it, and certainly I look at it, and considering whether we could get to a reasonable give and take amongst the parties, is it a fair balance between where the consumer advocate, large customers and other customers are represented, and Northwestern's case? Is it a fair outcome between those things? And I certainly think the credit rating agencies will look at the settlement as a whole with both base rate outcome, changes to PCAM, an update to base, some give and take on a path forward with other regulatory approaches from a Yellowstone perspective, and the fire proposal in the case providing for some deferral of the expense side of things as overall credit supportive. And if the commission would approve the settlement, that would be a favorable outcome.
Well, thank you. I've learned a lot, especially your answer to Commissioner Fielder's questions about some of the considerations that you have to take into account. And my questioning to you last Tuesday had to do with, you seem to make a really, really good case for establishing better credibility, better standing with the credit agencies. And my question at that time was, does this settlement, does it really advance that in any significant way, like to move something from a little b to a big B or a plus or something else like this? And so I'll you fleshed out more of that, but the answer last week was better, just better, without saying anything. And I wish that you described earlier some of the data that the credit agencies look at, and it seems to me you have a very good familiarity with what their standards are, what they're looking for. So I was a little disappointed in just better. Let me go through. I just used a yellow pen on here. Let me get to the next one here. In CDL 14, inflation above a nominal degree taking hold in an economy places enormous risk on regulated utilities. So at the time that you wrote this, the inflation rate was significantly higher, I believe, than it is right now. Has that inflation pressure, has that relieved itself to any significant degree?
The way I would state that is, at the time I wrote this last year, you were seeing year over year double-digit inflation. So I think the inflation report that came out last week was somewhere between 5 and 6%, but that's over last year when it was double-digit.
Yeah.
So while 5% feels better, but when it was already up, say 12% last year, then you're 17% up. Mm-hmm. So I would say the amount of increase has abated a bit, but when I look at our operating costs, and of course, buried in our operating costs is people and materials, all of that continues to go up. And I remain concerned that where we have contracts with vendors that will be repricing, that, you know, sometimes you have a 2 or 3 year locked pricing and not all of that payment has come due, shall we call it, that inflation will continue to be a challenge for us and continue to push up our costs beyond what's captured in this case.
Yeah, and I think I read recently about the availability of transformers to purchase, that ones that were available in a couple of months were now taking over a year, supply and demand. So the cost of those things have increased on there. Do you happen to know, is the company, do they have enough supply of those spare parts like that to be in a prudent position?
Mr. Cashel spends a lot of time on this topic, and particularly large transformers and small transformers have been quite the issue. I do know get these questions, which is, can we put in a, PO, a purchase order that basically says we're in line and we'll give you the price later? And the answer on specific transformers that, of course, keep the grid on is yes. So you're a price taker and you want, most importantly, to be in that line and to be able to get what literally is necessary for a substation to do its work and keep the lights on. And so there's been multiple situations where basically, typically you would have had all sorts of rules around what's the pricing. And it came back to the answer is yes, put in a PO and whatever the price is when it's done, we'll have to take it because we need it. Some of the other transformers at different sizes, right, that are needed in our jurisdiction, I would tell you that our folks over time have built really strong relationships with those vendors where we've treated them fairly in the past and they're treating us fairly today. And we've been able to, it makes us a bit uncomfortable, but at a level where we can continue our service. And I would tell you, I've heard from other utilities who maybe have different relationships with their vendors where their vendors have basically said, we don't have anything for you. So I think all of those things matter, but it's been an interesting 18 months to 2 years of a really big shift in what it's like to procure certain things.
On your pre-filed testimony, CDL 19, you refer to opportunity. Investors expect that regulatory utilities have the opportunity to earn their authorized return and where there is a consistent opportunity to achieve those earnings. But on CDL 23, you have a chart right there. And although it's really hard to read on here, it looks like in the middle column, the non-fuel O&M and for employee, whatever, the light blue is the O&M costs. And I see that those are higher than any of the people in your peer group. And I'm wondering, Northwestern has the opportunity to, through prudent management and operations, to earn a certain rate of return. And it seems to me, I'm not an accountant, I know nothing about accounting, but looking at this, it seems to be suggesting that the company is not doing a very good job on O&M relative to its peers.
The one, I would say these three go together because it's benchmarking all of those same items on a per customer,
yes,
per employee, and per millions of rate base. And you could see between O&M and A&G, we benchmark very favorably. But to your question of per employee, I would tell you we keep a lower headcount than our peers. And so in that metric, when you compare to a lower number of employees, it's going to make that number. So conversely, which would impact your total, both O&M and A&G. But If you had all the more employees employed by Northwestern, that metric would look better. And that's why I think these go together in a package of how are we doing when you look at all of them together, and how do we consider that? We've been very tight on headcount. And then the other thing that I would tell you that impacts this in fairness is we certainly use a fair amount of contract resources to provide expertise on construction, those sorts of things, whereas other utilities may hire those in-house. And if you combine those, I would tell you we benchmark very well. But we continue to look at those efficiencies.
So I remember when I first came on the commission, your former chairman, CEO, invited me to meet a bunch of people who were probably in this room. Just to get to know me and them and whatever like that. And I said something at the time that I thought that, and I told them that I might think that it was just a silly, naive thing to say, even a year from then, that as a Northwestern ratepayer, that if I was one of like 400,000, if you could save me $10 a year, that'd be $4 million to customers. And if the company could make a profit of $1 million by saving ratepayers $4 million, go for it. I'm highly in favor of that, which would indicate that the company is doing proactive things, really good management in order to provide savings like that. Do you see that anything along that line has really been accomplished by the company? I agree the company seems to be operating prudently, whatever, but in terms of saving money, earlier in your testimony, you talked about lowest cost to ratepayers, okay? Has anything really achieved in that regard? And does the settlement really go to that question?
So two things I would point you to figure 3 to say, have we achieved efficiencies in comparison to our peers? And I think this figure shows that we have, that we are benchmarking on a per customer, per employee, and per million of rate base for an O&M and A&G combined, that we are doing very well in that regard. The value of that is certainly in the ultimate cost to customers and providing bill headroom for investment, those sorts of things, and being able to stay out of rate cases. And certainly we did that for an extensive amount of time, combined with interest rates being low to decreasing, combined with tax rates coming down. All of that was a very good period for the customer because there was significant investment in infrastructure without a change from a broader rate perspective. And these efficiencies contributed to that. In an increasing cost environment, and I would tell you when we push our budget out to our operating folks and I tell them how much they're not getting and they're trying to manage against that, I would say today it's managing to, we just talked about inflation being double digits. Mm-hmm. And last year our O&M and A&G was up about 4%. I think that's really top-notch management to keep double-digit inflation to 4% from an OA&G perspective. And that, I think, ultimately provides a lot of value to customers. In the context of the settlement, again, the settlement takes a lot of things into account. And is it reasonable? You know, I just mentioned a 4% increase. Not all of that's in this revenue requirement. And of course, as we come in the next time, you'll capture those sorts of costs. But I think it's fair. And overall, and then certainly the part of coming in from a rate review perspective is the interveners test your data and they look at your costs and they hold you to account. And that's a part of where you sit as in between us and customers and providing that balance to competition.
I think in your testimony, and it's been 3 weeks since I read your testimony, so I apologize. There's a lot of it here. I
reread it all last night and I was shocked myself how much I put in there.
All of this last night.
I reread all of my stuff last night.
Yes. And I think you also addressed the need for the business technology writer and the enhanced wildfire mitigation. Well, given the and made you and other testifiers made really, really good case for those things. But what does that mean now that they are not in the settlement right there? Having said that, made the case pretty much that the company is at heightened cybersecurity risk because they don't have enough budget to buy more things to protect themselves. It would seem that if you're not having that business technology writer, that the company is not growing fast enough in its cybersecurity risk protection. Also, the wildfire mitigation. I mean, I'm convinced it's a good program. Whether or not that should be in rates and whether or not affordable and all that stuff. In the stipulation, what's going to happen to those two programs?
Sure. I'll take first the enhanced fire program. We've had a fire program for a very long time.
Yes.
So this was a proposal to continue to enhance that. And the settlement outcome that we reached with give and take amongst the parties is to allow for deferral of the expense portion of those costs. And so that certainly is a significant, while it's not cash supportive, it's earnings supportive, and it will allow us to defer those costs and then talk about recovery of them in the next rate review. So that's certainly supportive of our ability to continue on that enhanced wildfire program. Again, it's a compromise between no rider and some rider that we had to work on and come to an agreement. So I think that's a reasonable outcome, at least at this point, and how we move along in the fire rider. We will continue, or the fire program, we will continue to do that work. And I will certainly tell you the next time we're in, you will see capital costs related to that program as well. And then as to the BT rider, again, in give and take of all of those things, we decided to give on that one. But the thing that I would mention with regard to cyber, and you heard questioning regarding to how I think about financial risk and operational risk. And when I think about operational risk related to literally keeping the lights on, so how do you protect your system from a cyber perspective? We think an awful lot about that. So just because we didn't get the rider doesn't mean we're not going to spend there. It certainly will be tough decisions, and they're tough decisions all the time. And we ask our vendors to help us do it better, more efficient, but maintain the same level of strength from a cyber perspective. And so that's our challenge. And then certainly it'll likely mean a more frequent rate review to cover those costs, because there's certainly on the cyber side, that's the kind of stuff that you just have no idea how to quantify the level of risk. And how do you think about that?
Yes, I'm a member of the Montana ISAC and the Critical Infrastructure Committee for the National Association. I'm right on with you on that. On page 43 of your testimony, there's a term on here that I thought, wait a minute, I don't understand this term. Right in line 12, you refer to the execution of its planned cost control initiatives. What are those?
So the cost control initiatives, it's basically saying here is our ongoing part of holding O&M to numbers well below inflation.
Okay.
And so that's general how we look at, you just spoke about cyber. Those costs are going up exponentially more than our other costs, right? So we hold in line on other things to fund more cyber. That's what it's referring to here.
And then at the bottom of that page, in the quotation from Fitch, you say, the last line, Excel and Black Hills have significant operations in Colorado under a regulatory framework that Fitch considers to be, I did slow down, but not enough, apparently. Okay. Excel, XCEL, and Black Hills have significant operations in Colorado under a regulatory framework that Fitch considers to be more constructive than Montanans. So, more constructive. Is this settlement or what you asked for in the rate case? Is it really going to be constructive or just better? Sorry, this is related to from previous thing, but I'm just going through the book. So
I think I understand your question in the context of apparently my statements last week. And again, I would say the credit rating agencies will view this settlement as a package, if approved, as constructive to from an overall regulatory proceeding and to Northwestern's financial health.
Yeah, it's trying to understand what a really good regulatory posture is, from our point of view. I mean, just me in particular, I want to make sure that any regulatory procedures that we have are as fair to the company and the ratepayer as possible. So I'm interested in something that might be better than it is now from that point of view. On page 46, you refer to, and while not asking for it in this case, allowing a return to be earned on PPAs would be another effective tool to promote rating stability. What do you see the future of that? Is the company asking for that? It's sort of like an oblique reference to something. I've long been interested in that.
I think Northwestern, my statement here is in the context of Northwestern's unique to its peers and being, the history of deregulation in Montana. That whole background leads to we're more on the market, less resource adequate than our peers. So we have more PPA obligations that bump up against our balance sheet in the sense our balance sheet is supporting that credit. And so my comment here is, while we didn't ask for it in this case, we may at some future time consider asking for a return on PPAs to support that credit that our balance sheet extends.
I notice in Billings on Airport Road, there is a very, very large substation being built next to one that already exists. And so I assume it's because the load is demanding more than the other one could provide, and build a new one instead of rebuilding the old one. Does the commission, I assume that that's a major expense. Does the commission ever have an opportunity to pass upon the prudency of that expenditure?
So I would answer that in two parts. I believe you'd be referring to the Rimrock substation, and Mr. Cashel would have loved this question because that Rimrock substation sits at such a critical spot on our system. And you think of the closure of generation units 1 and 2 around Billings, Correct, et cetera, what that has done and the need for what that substation does. And Steve Rosenka, who leads our substations, they could go on and on. It's a very expensive endeavor, but it's certainly critical from a reliability and capacity perspective to upgrade that substation to do the load in Billings is unique. And I'll stop there because I'm not an engineer. I just hear them from their pulpit on this topic a lot. With regard to recovery, I will tell you in our next rate review, that substation will be in there and you can ask all the questions you would like about it, but it's a very significant capital project for us.
So we do have an opportunity to.
In each rate review, we'll bring all of our rate base, but certainly highlight more material ones. And I will tell you Rimrock is one of those.
And I apologize, on Tuesday when this hearing commenced, I was traveling. I was on my phone in an airport basically the whole time. The only time I was off is when I was actually on the airplane and they said, "Thou shalt not." So, but I know this was discussed. So please help me if I'm on page 54 of your testimony. It talks about the coal strip at Unit 4 should be based on a 10% ROE, because that could never be changed. 6.5% cost of debt. And I think that was an issue as to whether or not, if that had been refinanced, if that should still be in there. Was that in the agreement? Was that 6.5 can never change?
My understanding of the commission's order is the capital structure, the cost of debt, and ROE were set for the life of that facility.
I wouldn't have voted for that.
I will tell you my color commentary of being at a very lower level in the company at the time is the CFO at the time was not happy that the person on the stand, Mr. Hines, committed to that because, it was an interesting time, et cetera, but facts and circumstances at the time. Right. And, but over time, that one is set from a capital structure, ROE, and cost of capital.
At the time, 6.5% might have seemed like one hell of a good deal.
Indeed. We'll see where the Fed goes this year. It might look good again.
In page 56 of your testimony, you refer to the $22 million figure. I wrote down, what was this about? I read your explanation. I don't know what that has to do with. Please explain why you excluded the $22 million in rate base reduction ordered in the stipulation agreement. I don't understand that.
So that is an agreement with I'll call it a long tail. So when a rate review was settled at that time, and part of the agreement of the parties was a reduction in rate base forever, and it amortizes off. And so it was originally a $38.8 million item. It has amortized down to $22 million. So forever that impacts or I shouldn't say forever, until it amortizes off, we take that into account when we make each of our filings per the stipulation agreed to at that time.
Very good. And that's all the yellow I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
President.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Commissioner Pinocci.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple questions. I see where we describe how volatility and uncertainty to supply markets have impacted Northwestern? Without asking a ton of questions, I'll get right to the point. We're going to build a gas plant. We're going to use more natural gas. And when we have less natural gas to buy, the price could go up. Then my retired senior citizens are saying, you're going to turn around and raise the rates to heat my home because you're using a bunch of natural gas to generate electricity. Okay. So a question that might come up is we have Hepkin Reservoir that has no turbine in it. Northwestern has told me on a few occasions that they're thinking of putting a turbine there and generate electricity. I got Gibson Reservoir not far from my home looking to put a turbine in. Northwestern meets with Gibson Reservoir Greenfield Irrigation District. The transmission lines are going from the dam to Augusta, which ties into Northwestern Energy. Wouldn't it be a better investment to generate electricity at these two dams that are already built without turbines? We don't have to buy natural gas. The water's free. And I would think the ratepayer would get a better deal. And in your testimony where we have uncertainty in what natural gas pricing is going to be, why wouldn't we do that first?
Objection, relevance.
Yes. I'm going to, Ms. Lael, if you can.
I think I can answer it because I can't really answer it in the sense of I don't know the cost effectiveness of those other supply resources and what they look like. Mr. Hines or Mr. Lefebvre would be the ones to speak to what any of those other resources may cost, and I can't speak to them.
Right. If we're concerned about volatility in the gas market, why do we want to build a plant that's going to use gas that could drive up the price of heating our homes later? How do you want me to explain that to the ratepayer?
I think the gas plant offers unique features, right? And the ability to ramp up and down is certainly a core value to provide the baseload firming we need for variable generation. So the aspects of a gas plant and how that fits the nature of our load, I think other witnesses can speak to. As to the market pricing of gas, the key piece there is we do have the ability to lock in pricing to deliver to that facility. And certainly the on-system deliverability and the location of that was chosen based off gas supply availability. So you can't entirely mitigate it, but I also think the supply team, and again, outside my lane a fair amount here, but there's the ability to specifically contract for the resources needed for that facility.
All right. So I don't know, a year ago, we have to raise the rates because the price of natural gas went up. Why can't I turn around and say we should have locked that in so that wouldn't have happened?
I think there's whole dockets on how we lock those prices in and layer model and what we hedge and fixed price deliverability, all those sorts of things. And our exposure from normal to peak is where you typically see when we're load serving gas, where we see the most exposure to customers. But I think there's been separate dockets on hedging and the commission's viewpoint on where we transact from a fixed price physical delivery to where financial instruments expose risk on both sides. And that would probably be outside this docket as to mitigating the risk of supply volatility on the natural gas side.
No more questions, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner Pinochi. Commissioner Bukacek, are you still on?
I am. No question, Mr. President.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Lael, I do have some questions for you. I'm going to pick up where Ms. Tranell sort of left off with her cross-examination. Let's start with stock-based compensation.
Okay.
I think you answered Ms. Tranell that you had read the testimony of the Montana Consumer Council and the large customer group and the adjustments that they made to electric and natural gas revenue requirements, correct?
Yes.
And it's my understanding that both the MCC and the large customer group made adjustments to remove the expenses associated with stock-based compensation for non-executive employees and the board of directors, correct?
Yes.
It's my understanding both these parties asserted before the stipulation that these costs should be borne by the shareholders and not the ratepayers, correct?
Yes.
All right. With that stated, could you explain how the stock-based compensation programs work for the non-executive employees and board of directors function? For example, what I'm driving at, are these actual stock awards or are they stock options?
So two things I would separate from the board and our broader employee program, but they are not options. They are both stock awards that are tied to performance over a 3-year period, and vest in that regard. With regard to total compensation, and certainly the other parties had comments on how you compensate. And I would tell you that as a part of setting a total compensation, that's a market compensation to attract and retain talent at a director and above level, which is typically where that stock-based compensation is awarded. That is fair market compensation. And so each individual's compensation is divided between base salary and then pay at risk. Pay at risk takes 2 components. That's an annual incentive program tied to safety, reliability, customer sat, and sticking to your budget essentially. And then the stock-based piece is an additional component of variable compensation for leaders at Northwestern. And that ties to Northwestern's performance over a longer horizon, but they are stock grants. They are not options, and they are subject to performance for vesting.
Okay. With that stated, then could you explain to the commission how the expense impacts of the stock-based compensation, I think you might have disagreed with that statement, but are calculated then?
My response is going to be it's complicated, but I can give you I'll try it a simple version of that. So every year the board reviews and approves grants that are relative to the analysis that's provided to them to market compensation. Those grants, our programs so far from a stock perspective, are divided between total shareholder return and a return on average equity and net income. This is where my manner may have indicated it gets complicated because you recognize that over the service period. So these are 3-year grants. So just think of ratable amortization, but the valuation of that award is a little complicated. The TSR composition is valued by an external firm, Willis Towers Watson. And regardless of performance outcome, once that valuation is complete, you recognize that expense. For the other portion that's related to return on average equity and net income, you adjust to actual performance. For instance, the last 3-year period, you grant at a target, which is 100%, it paid out 20%. So we adjusted expense and reduced it for that reduction. But on the TSR side, you don't adjust to actual performance. So trying not to make it too complicated, but in each given period, you would have 3 tranches of that stock-based compensation outstanding, and you would be recognizing a targeted expense amount, and there may be adjustments based off actual performance.
Okay, and you may have answered this as part of your response there, but are the expense dollars based on the par value of the stock?
At the grant date, there's a valuation done. So the return on average equity and net income portion is the stock price less dividends discounted over the time. So a pretty simple DCF for 3 years. There are no dividends allowed during the period. The TSR portion is done by Willis Towers Watson, and it's a Black-Scholes-Burton model of all the probabilistic outcomes over time. And I would tell you the stock per share amount is typically lower than what that DCF model would be. And so in simplistic terms, if the other side came out at $50, that typically will be lower. It's $40. And then it's time the number of shares times the 3 years.
Right. Can you explain to the commission the term non-executive employee? What type of employee is eligible for this award?
Yes. So non-executive, there's 9 or 10 executives. You can look at Northwestern, anyone with a vice president title is an executive. Non-executive stock-based comp is, think about your next 100 leaders that lead key areas of the organization. It's typically your director level and above employees. And again, that's where the market data would indicate that type of a role would have multiple elements of compensation. I missed earlier, of course, our benefits package, but your base salary plus variable compensation includes both incentive and stock-based compensation. For your broader set of employees, so that's think director and a level and above, probably about 100 employees, they do not participate in stock-based compensation.
Okay, taking the 2021 test year, then how many non-executive employees receive stock-based compensation?
I would say, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it'd be less than 100.
Okay, and do you know the average value of the award per employee?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
Okay, in your rebuttal testimony, if you have that in front of you.
I do.
So you would agree with me that as part of your rebuttal testimony, you address the proposed LCG and MCC revenue requirement adjustments for stock-based compensation, correct?
I do.
Okay. Can you explain to the commission why it's appropriate, why Northwestern Energy believes it's appropriate for ratepayers rather than shareholders to bear the costs of stock-based compensation awards for non-executive employees in the board of directors?
Yes, I think customers benefit from attracting, retaining talented folks. So when you need a director of substations, or you heard Nate Linder earlier, central operations, those sorts of key positions, the only way you attract and retain those sorts of employees is through a market competitive compensation package. A market competitive compensation package includes typically some sort of base pay, some sort of annual incentive, and some sort of longer term incentive. For publicly traded entities, that's typically in the form of stock-based comp, in the sense of what should customers pay for. Those are employees who are wholly dedicated to utility service, and a total rewards package, total compensation being recoverable from customers is a reasonable thing.
All right, let's talk about incentive compensation.
Okay.
You would agree with me that both MCC and LCG make adjustments to requirements for annual incentive plan awards for financial performance, correct?
Yes.
It's my understanding that MCC asserts that incentives to approve financial performance are not necessarily consistent with ratepayer interests. Do you agree that that's the nature of their testimony?
I agree, that's their assertion, yes.
And for the LCG, they assert that awards for financial performance should be funded by shareholders who are primary beneficiaries of meeting or exceeding financial targets.
I agree, that's their assertion, yes.
So in sum, both of them believe that this is not a cost that the ratepayer should be carrying.
Yes.
Okay. It's my understanding that Northwestern Energy provides an annual incentive plan, an AIP. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Okay. What is an AIP?
It's an annual incentive plan. We call it annual or short term. And on an annual basis, employees receive an incentive, and that is tied to financial performance and safety, reliability, and customer satisfaction. And it's targeted based off a % of their base pay.
And Northwestern Energy, as I understand it, has both union and non-represented employees, correct?
We do.
Did I state that correctly, both union and non-represented? Correct.
Represented and non-represented, yes.
All right. So as I understand it, the AIP is available to all non-represented regular full-time, regular part-time, limited part-time. Is correct?
Yes, the plan for represented folks is materially different, and there is a small incentive plan for represented, but the most significant dollars are the non-represented.
Okay, is there a component of the AIP awards for achieving certain financial performance goals?
Yes. 55%. If you're saying it's 100% a payout, there's 15% that's customer satisfaction, 15% that's safety, 15% that's reliability, and then 55% is basically meeting your budget.
So how does Northwestern Energy determine whether an individual employee contributed to the meeting of the corporate financial metrics?
It's an overall metric. So it's based off how the company does in total and how we determine the payout for that plan. The key piece there is the whole company needs to be focused on, and we were talking about earlier, how efficiencies benefit customers. We think this is something that's good for both customers and shareholders both. But the key piece is remaining fiscal discipline and incenting our colleagues to do so. So the overall payout is determined on our net income.
Okay, so based on where you left off, so what percentage of the total dollar value of AIP awards are based on financial performance?
55%.
Okay, and you may have answered this, but how many employees receive AIP awards?
I don't know that number off the top of my head. I think our represented count is over 600, subject to check. It's somewhere in that neighborhood, and the remaining employees would be non-represented and would all receive annual incentive plan.
And again, do you know what the average dollar value of the AIP award?
I don't know what the average dollar value would be off the top of my head. And those dollar value targets are determined based off market compensation. So that one position, the target for annual incentive may be different than for another.
Okay, that's all the questions. Oh, I got one more. All right, so the obvious question then. So please explain to commission what is the benefit of the ratepayers to the ratepayers of the financial-based performance awards?
Again, I would reiterate that fiscal discipline and what we just talked about with efficiency, managing O&M and the A&G costs, I think that's an incredible value to customers and certainly something we should be incenting our employees to do and provides significant benefit to customers over the long run.
Okay, I don't have any further questions, Mr. Hamilton.
No questions, Mr. President.
Okay, well, we have spent some time on Ms. Lael, to say the least. Time for recross, Ms. Trinnell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Crystal, following up from that where you just were, talking about the incentive compensation expenses, and I don't know if you reviewed the 3 separate line items. Those were the lion's share of the reductions recommended by MCC and LCG.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And I think you just said that the overall payout is based on net income. That's what I thought I heard you say.
Of that portion of the overall. So there's, if you would say 100%, 55% is net income.
Okay. And are you involved with the SEC annual reports that Northwestern files?
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware of the fact that in 2021, Northwestern reported net income of $186.8 million?
That sounds correct.
Okay. Up from 155 in 2020, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So an increase of a little over $30 million annually.
Yes. 2020's COVID impact and decline from the prior year being over 200 million, I believe, was really significant to us.
So the question then is, you are, and all of that net income goes to those people in New York, BlackRock, and your investors, right?
I would not say it that way. No.
Well, you're an investor-owned utility, are you not?
Right.
So,
and you don't, investors receive return in 2 ways: price appreciation of your stock and dividends. They don't directly get your net income.
Has Northwestern paid out dividends?
Yes.
In 2020?
Yes.
2021?
Yes.
2022?
Yes.
Okay. And so essentially what you're incenting this compensation is incenting is to create more profit for your investors, correct?
What we're incenting is for our employees to know their budgets and be aware of them and efficiently manage the business, which certainly should result in earnings growth and us having the opportunity to earn our returns.
Okay, let's look at page 19 and of your direct testimony, following up on this. And let me know when you're there.
I am.
And you're talking about why Northwestern under earns. And at lines 3 to 7, you're saying that when you reflect the profit and it falls short of the return on invested assets, and I'm summarizing, that's under earning.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so who is responsible? I mean, there was some colloquy back and forth about you really need the commission to give you what you're asking for so that your investors will look at you favorably. But who's really responsible for whether or not Northwestern is under earning? Who has control over that?
Certainly management has control over a significant portion of that.
Thank you. And then you talked about rate review cases, and I thought I heard you say it's beneficial to investors when there is time between rate cases, that's a favorable thing from investors' viewpoint. Is that accurate?
I did not say that.
Okay. Then I misunderstood what you said. So I was trying to follow along, and I thought you were talking about having some certainty and having the rate of return set. Did I misunderstand? So how can you help me out there?
I think what I mentioned is customers certainly can benefit when you're investing significant amounts, but not changing rates. Ultimately, they're seeing price stability, and that's good for customers. Certainly from an investor perspective, their measure is going to be, did you earn your returns during that time? And if you can stay out of rate cases and earn your returns, that's favorable. But the facts and circumstances of timing between rate cases, they're going to look at your actual earned returns, not necessarily the literal amount of time.
Okay. And would you agree that your last rate case was an increase based on a settlement of $6.5 million?
Yes.
Okay. And so when we're looking at $169 million in a settlement and more in the application, that doesn't seem like rate stability to me.
And again, you're mixing apples and oranges because the 169 includes PCAM and property tax versus the 6.5 does not. 6.5 is base rate only.
Fair. Let's take PCAM out.
So if you take PCAM and property taxes out and compare it to the 6.5, I think that number is 81.5.
I think 81.5 is the electric, right?
Electric is 60 sub million. I didn't think I'd lose these off the top of my head, but electric plus gas, I think, is a base rate is 81.5. It's in the joint one if I have that put in front of me.
Still a fairly significant increase.
Yes, and we've talked about the reasons why that is.
And you've said you've talked about this next rate review that you're anticipating, and my working assumption based on what we've talked about to date in this hearing has been that you would be coming in asking for the recovery of the capital costs of the gas plant, which are around $270. That there's some portion of the Byron pipeline would be in there, which I think was 30 million total, but we don't know which portion is here and which will be there. Are you following me?
I think so.
Okay. So, and then you were testifying about the Rimrock substation, and I think you said that that was a significant capital investment and that would be included in the next rate review. Do I have that right?
Yes.
Any idea how much?
I don't have that number off the top of my head.
All right. So probably more than $300 million in the next rate review.
I can tell you our capital plans are public and they're in our documents, and we're investing significant amounts of capital in excess of depreciation. So that's inherently going to grow that rate base from what's depreciating off. And I would certainly expect to see an overall increase in rate base in the next case.
Okay. So we're looking at 169 here, another 300 in the next rate case, which if I remember what you had told me before correctly, it was about, you were thinking you'd do that within a year. Is that right?
The premise of your question, you said 169 here. And again, property tax and supply is outsized impact compared to base rates. The 300 is a capital asset that would be recovered over an extended life. So you're not asking for 300 million in a case. You're asking for instance, 1/25 of that times a rate of return. So just making sure we're talking about the same things. The revenue requirement formula is that rate base times a return on plus your cost of service. So you'd have depreciation, which is return of. It's not $300 million in one fell swoop. That's the price stability provided by owned assets.
Right. The complexities of rate making being what they are, but nevertheless, customers' bills will go up significantly.
Objection assumes facts not in evidence.
Again, I can't predict what rate base may be at that time.
Thank you. Mr. President, I am going to ask some indulgence because it came up with commissioner questions. I would like to revisit the coal strip debt, if with your permission. It did come up.
You're absolutely right. It did come up. So go ahead.
Thank you. And I'd like to get the exhibit that we were using for the coal strip debt, which I think is over here.
Sorry, what?
Well, I'll try to do it without it.
Okay.
And keep it short. Crystal, do you remember the conversation we were having about debt on Colstrip?
Yes.
And in response to Commissioner O'Donnell's questions, you said the order is what it is. You can't do anything about it. It can't be changed by the commission, right?
That's my general understanding of that order.
Okay. And when we walked through these calculations, we had offered this as 350 Montana Exhibit 21, which I had distributed, and I think everybody had access to it. And I can put it in front of the witness if I may approach.
You may, but I would just remind you that Commissioner O'Donnell asked about the 10% ROE and the 6.5 cost of debt. So try to work within those confines.
Okay, Mr. President, I'm trying to keep this narrow. So within the confines of the 10% ROE and the locked in 6.5% debt, and it's your testimony that Northwestern is not in fact paying any debt utility wide at 6.5%. That's what we had talked about earlier, right?
Correct.
Your debt's at 4.01%, correct?
That is the average of all of the pieces of debt currently, yes.
All right. And so if you apply that to the ROE for Colstrip, you come up, if we, the customers of Montana, are paying to Northwestern the debt on Colstrip as if it's 6.5%, and you, the utility, are paying on that in reality at 4%, that's a net gain to the utility of almost $3.5 million, right?
I would not agree it's a gain.
Okay, well, the net difference of the remaining, let's break it down, the remaining debt that's owed on Colstrip is about $276 million, right? 100 million.
The rate base has declined from the initial 407 million to the current roughly 276 million. That's correct.
And if you finance that $276 million at 6.5% compared to financing it at 4%, the difference is about $3.5 million annually. Do you agree with that math?
I believe the 50% of the capital structure that is debt, that is the math.
Thank you for that clarification. 50% being about $138 million.
Yes.
Thank you. So the commission could certainly take into account this request that Northwestern is approaching it with and saying, we need $169 million or 82 on the electric side, if you want to just break it out that way. And the commission could say, well, we know this order exists out there. We can't change the capital structure. We can't change what that order says, but we can take into account, in fairness to Montana ratepayers, that we are overpaying $3.5 million annually. And they could certainly credit that to Montana customers. Couldn't the commission do that?
Again, the stipulation is taken in a whole, and there were reductions in ROE. There were reductions in depreciation. There were as an unspecified economic impact to address all of these issues in a total package. So if you cherry pick one item, my response would be, I would have needed a higher ROE, or I would have given less in depreciation, or I would have given less in the overall economic adjustment. It is a holistic settlement taken in total. And the key consideration for the commission is when you pick out these individual items is what have our earned returns been? And we have been materially under earning much more than the $3 million you're pointing out here.
Thank you, which would, from the ratepayers' perspective, certainly be a good argument for the commission to reject the settlement and do this on a line-by-line basis, correct?
I would disagree.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions, Mr. President.
Mr. Nell, just for your awareness, we do have a copy of your prior exhibit.
And I'm going to take a run at it again. I'll move for the admission of 350 Exhibit 21.
Objection, lack of foundation. As I objected to our exhibits earlier, I haven't been able to cross-examine Mr.
I'm gonna deny admission. All right, I got thrown off. Yep. May I see? Okay. Northwestern Energy redirect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Lael, how does a declining rate base that you spoke of Colstrip affect customers?
In this rate review, you would see that the rate base, so in contrast to the T&D side of our business where we're reinvesting in excess of the amount that to grow rate base, you would see the value of generation to being owned by a utility is, I always call it the own versus rent. When you rent over time, you just pay those costs out. You never get anything back for it versus own. You have an asset over time that should lower in its cost to you. You see that value in Colstrip. We just talked about the initial value of Colstrip the customers would have been paying for was in excess of $400 million. And the last rate review that can in the overall revenue required, Colstrip would have been less because that rate base had come down to just over $300 million. In this case, we're bringing it down to $276 million. And that's, I think, roughly $25 million lower than it was in the last case. So the math we were just doing of the return, which contributes to a component of the revenue required, that component would be lower than it was in the last case.
And will that continue to depreciate in the next rate case?
As I understand Colstrip and generally generation and our projected CapEx there, we would expect that the CapEx would not grow the rate base. We wouldn't be reinvesting in excess of depreciation there, and that you would continue to see a declining rate base. And again, broader rate making, you would see that with generation assets in general.
I have no further questions.
All right, very good. What would you like to do with this witness?
I'd like to temporarily excuse her, please.
All right, Ms. Lael, you are temporarily excused. All right, before we get to our next witness, Northwestern, can you aver to me how many more witnesses you intend to call?
I'm sorry, was that directed towards me?
I can do it. We have Jeff Berzina, Elaine Rich, Jennifer Nelson, and Cynthia Fang, and Bobby Schroppel for tomorrow. So that's 5.
Okay. All right. So, Mr. Uda, I seem to recall that you had asked for a witness accommodation. Maybe I'm misremembering.
Yeah, Mr. President, Roger Schiffman, who's the witness for Broadreach, is scheduled to testify on Wednesday. And I think he needs Wednesday. I can check to see if he can do it earlier if your concern is that the hearing might be ending up tomorrow.
Frankly, Mr. Root, I appreciate that comment. My concern is we're going past Wednesday at this point, but I do, you know, if things move at a faster clip than they have for the last 2 days, I just want to make sure that your witness might be available to be called earlier.
Yeah, he could possibly be. I mean, I haven't checked with him. The way the schedule was, the way I looked at it originally, it looked like he was second to last. So, I mean, I'll do what I can to make him available, but he did tell me that he was free on the afternoon Wednesday. So he's not free from 12 to 1, but I told him that wouldn't be an issue for us because we usually break for lunch.
Okay. Okay. Is there any other party that thinks they may need a witness accommodation for tomorrow? Yeah, we got Roy. Okay, seeing none. All right, Northwest Energy, you may proceed to your next witness.
If you could just, we will call Jeffrey Prezina.
Good afternoon, Mr. Prezina. Have you been sworn in? All right, would you raise your right hand? Do you swear the testimony you are about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth? All right. Mr. Prezina, would you pull the microphone right up to you? And is the blue light on? Okay.
How about that?
All right, you're good.
All right.
Your witness.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Prezina, would you please state your name, spelling your last name, and your business address for the record?
Yes, Jeff Berzina. Last name is spelled Berzina.
And by whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
And what is your title at Northwestern?
Controller.
Did you submit pre-filed direct testimony in this docket?
I did.
Placed before you is a document that's been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit NWE 38. If you would review that and let me know when you've finished. If I were to ask you under oath today the same questions that are set forth in that exhibit, would your answers be the same except for any corrections or modifications?
They would be the same.
Do you have any corrections or modifications that you need to make?
I do not.
Thank you. Mr. President, I would move for the admission of Exhibit NWE 38.
Any objection to NWE 38? Seeing none, NWE 38 is admitted.
Thank you. Mr. Berzina, did you submit pre-filed rebuttal testimony in this docket?
I did.
And placed before you is a document that has been marked for identification purposes as Exhibit NWE 39. You'd take a moment to review that and let me know when you've finished. Is NWE 39 a true and correct copy of your pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
It appears to be.
And if I were to ask you under oath today the same questions that are set forth in that testimony, would your answers be the same except for any corrections or modifications?
They would be the same.
Do you have any corrections or modifications that you need to make?
I do not.
Mr. President, I would move for the admission of Exhibit NWE 39.
Any objection to NWE 39? Seeing none, NWE 39 is admitted.
With that, this witness is available for cross-examination and questioning.
Okay, parties, I do intend that we go to the 5 o'clock hour. So cross-examination. Mr. Brown?
No questions.
Mr. Nelson? Captain Duffy? Mr. Nell? No. There you go.
Good afternoon, Jeff. I'm Monica Trinell and I represent 350 Montana.
Good afternoon.
I just want to ask you a couple of questions about Sleepy Hollow, which is on page 30 of your direct testimony. How did you get to a net book value of $500,000 for that asset?
Yeah, so at the time it was an estimate. We had very limited information at the time the docket was going on. We actually started reviewing from an accounting standpoint materials that were filed by Sleepy Hollow with the Montana Public Service Commission. That was about as good information as we had at the time. So as we worked through and building our estimate for the year, $500,000 was the best estimate that we could come up with at that time.
And is that something that will be billed to Montana customers, that $500,000? Is that going to go into rate base and then you'll earn a profit on that?
Yeah, keeping in mind that that's from my direct testimony that was updated in rebuttal.
And what was the difference?
So the difference we ended up with in rate base, a total cost that would have been $211,000. And because we do a simple average for our rate base, it ends up being in rate base at a little around $105,000.
And how is that treated in the stipulation? Do you know?
I guess not specifically to the rate base amount.
And I don't know if you heard the public comment when Ed Butcher came in and said those assets had been essentially on the verge of bankruptcy. Did you hear that?
I generally recall that, yeah.
Okay. So what evidence do you have now to support the dollar value that you're assigning those assets?
So the information that we ended up having still came from the Montana Public Service Commission reports that Sleepy Hollow had filed. And the new information that we had would have more represented the assets that we ended up acquiring. My recollection is there's some buildings and such that were in there that we didn't end up bringing into Northwestern, and that drove a substantial part of the difference.
Was there any independent third-party audit, accounting, review, assessment done?
As far as the book value of those assets? No, we compared the book value to what we could discern from the book value. We compared that to our actual, what we looked at as a purchase price, including all of the costs that were incurred for that. And that's what arrived at $211 million, which let me correct that. $211,000, which also approximated what we were seeing as book value. And keeping in mind, the books and records were pretty light for Sleepy Hollow.
And no acquisition adjustment, correct?
Correct.
No further questions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Ms. Trinell, HRC. Ms. Ruda?
No questions.
Renewable Northwest. MEIC.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just one, I think. Which is it your understanding that the full electric rate base, as reflected in your exhibits as corrected by your rebuttal testimony, is reflected in the stipulated revenue requirement in the settling party stipulation provided?
I didn't take part in the settlement discussions, so I would refer back to probably Crystal Lale, who was more involved in those.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is time for commissioner questions. Vice President Fielder.
do have questions. Not very many, though. Mr. Berzina, let's see, I'm looking at your rebuttal testimony and on pages JBB3 and JBB4, you provide an updated electric rate base amount. I'll let you get to that. The updated electric rate base amount of approximately 2.8 billion and an updated natural gas rate base amount of approximately 582.8 million. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Could you speak to the importance of capital assets and investments and specifically how these aid Northwestern Energy in providing safe, reliable, and affordable service to its customers?
Not sure I'm the best one to speak to the how those are actually used in providing the utility service. Our operations staff is probably best at that. What we look at from an accounting perspective is looking to determine that they are used and useful in the system. And that's generally the trigger for when those go in service and are used and useful, that we put them into rate base.
Okay. How does Northwestern ensure best practices in its management of the physical assets?
I'd once again probably point to our operations staff on how they manage that. Not sure I'm the best one to answer that.
Okay. Do you have a process for ensuring that the asset is fulfilling its purpose, providing the most value possible?
I wouldn't specifically say that that I'm involved in that process, but yes, I would believe that we do look at generally as a company to ensure that we're using the assets most effectively.
Who would be the best witness on the questions regarding asset management and ensuring that they are fulfilling their purpose and providing the most value possible?
Generally, I would think that would be our operations staff. That would probably go back to a Mike Cashel or Pohl, John Hines for the supply side.
Does Northwestern use any type of a risk to value assessment tool for asset management?
Risk to value?
Risk to value.
As far as making a determination of whether or not it is a prudent investment to make at the time?
Yes, some type of standards that are applied to help assess risk to value.
Sure. I would think that.
President, if I may, Commissioner Fielder, we do have John Carmody, who's part of this case, and he is in distribution operations. He speaks to asset management. Actually, his exact title, but I think it has asset management in it. So if these questions, they could be asked of him, we can make him available if needed.
Yes, Mr. President, Mr. Carmody was one of the ones that was excused on that mass list that the parties agreed to, the stipulation. So I wasn't sure I'd be able to ask him questions, but if I'd be glad to defer to him if he's available.
If there are questions, we will certainly make him available. It may be by Zoom because he is based out of Butte.
That would be fine with me at another time, Mr. President.
If Northwestern Energy is agreeable to that and don't object to recalling him.
We do not.
All right.
Okay, thank you. No more questions then. Thank you.
Commissioner O'Donnell? Commissioner Panochi?
No questions, Mr. President.
Commissioner Bukacek? Commissioner Bukacek? While we're waiting for Commissioner Bukacek, I'll just proceed. Mr. Berzina, thank you for your testimony today. Can you go to your direct testimony, please? Page 34. And I'll direct you to I'll direct you to lines 13 through 15. And I'm just going to read what your testimony says, and if it doesn't, then please correct me. But I believe you state that in order to allow for recovery, Northwestern proposes to defer and accumulate costs associated with any strategic natural gas production. The costs accumulated would include the revenue requirement of such facility, allowing for accumulation and eventual recovery of O&M costs, depletion expense taxes, return on rate base, etc., from the point of the asset purchase until included within the utility revenues through a subsequent natural gas general rate review. That is your testimony, correct?
Correct.
Okay. I don't know if you were here when Mr. Lefebvre testified, but I started to ask him a line of questions.
He pointed to me.
He did.
Okay.
So I'm going to direct these to you. My question is, based on this testimony, are you directly asking the commission for approval of a regulatory asset?
I would say that we're asking directly for the commission's direction to allow us to defer the costs, which I guess I'd clarify that even further to say that that could lead to a regulatory asset, depending on an internal analysis of the probability of recovery. But really what we're asking the commission for is the deferral of costs.
So to confirm your testimony, Northwestern Energy, according to your testimony, is requesting the commission approve a deferred accounting treatment?
Yes.
Mr. Brazina, what weighted cost of capital would Northwestern Energy propose to utilize in its revenue requirement calculations for the small natural gas production assets?
I believe it'd be consistent with the rest of the natural gas case. So whatever we end up settling on.
I'm not sure that answers my questions.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. I was asking what the weighted cost of capital you're proposing to utilize in the revenue requirement.
So our rate of return that we would use, return on rate base, is that what you're asking?
You can answer it from that perspective.
Okay. Well, I would think that it would be the same return on rate base that we'd be using in the rest of the natural gas rate case, which I think through the stipulation was using a 9.54 or 9.55 ROE and the 4.01 cost of capital or cost of debt. So.
Is that different than what was proposed originally? Do you know?
Originally in our direct filing?
Yes, through the application and supporting testimony.
Yes, I think we were originally asking for 10.6 for both gas and electric.
All right, Mr. Brazina, final question. When Northwestern requests recovery of the acquisition costs, do you anticipate Northwestern Energy will present the cost information for each small natural gas production asset acquisition? Or do you think Northwestern will aggregate these transactions?
I guess I hadn't thought that far of how we would present it, but we would provide the information necessary for the commission to make a determination of the future recovery at that next rate review filing.
So I think what I'm hearing from your testimony is you haven't decided that?
I would say we haven't thought through the filing of it, but if the information should be available for that. But when we file our revenue requirement, it's usually, as you see in my schedules, it would be aggregated, but there could always be a separate list that is included if that information was requested.
Okay. No further questions. Thank you. Mr. Hamilton?
No questions.
Okay. Back to cross. Ms. Trinell? No questions? MEIC? Okay, redirect.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a couple quick ones. Mr. Brazina, Ms. Trinnell was asking you about the Sleepy Hollow rate base, and you had mentioned $105,000 that's in your rebuttal. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And is that $105,000 in the natural gas revenue requirement?
It is part of the revenue requirement, yes.
Do you know what impact that inclusion or that amount has on the revenue requirement?
Not off the top of my head, but it's very insignificant.
Okay, that's all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I would ask that this witness be permanently excused.
Any objection to permanently excusing Mr. Berzina? Seeing none, Mr. Berzina, you are permanently excused. Thank you for your testimony today. All right, what I'd like you to do is call your next witness. Let's get the testimony in the record and we can pick up tomorrow morning.
I have one, I could do that. But if Dr. Roy is going first, would
that's
that
true.
mess things up?
Oh, that's fair. Okay, well, all right, the time is 4:56. Pete. Okay, I don't know if you heard that. Mr. Nell indicated she'd be remote tomorrow. Any other housekeeping matters? Okay, so again, we're starting tomorrow, 8:30 or earlier time than 9 a.m. this morning. So 8:30. Again, we will have public comment at 9 o'clock. We have agreed to have Dr. Roy start his testimony at 8 o'clock. Is he going to be in person or remote? Okay. Any other matters before we go off the record for the day? Okay. Just make sure for those of you that have witnesses that are still pending, just kind of be in touch with them about timing. If things move faster tomorrow. We don't want to miss anybody's testimony. All right. Time is now 4:57 p.m. We will go off the record and restart at 8:30 in the morning.